There is something you have been fighting tonight. Maybe you cannot name it, exactly, only feel it as a tightness behind the eyes. A low hum of resistance running beneath everything. The sense that if you could just fix one more thing, resolve one more thought, figure out one more answer, then you could finally rest. And yet here you are, still awake, still holding what the ancient teachers of Asia knew and what 10,000 years of sitting in stillness has slowly revealed, is that the exhaustion you feel is rarely from what life has given you. It is from the fighting, the constant, invisible, effortful fighting against what simply is. Tonight, we will not try to fix anything. We will travel together through 10 stories from across the Buddhist world, from mountain monasteries in Korea, where monks sat for decades asking questions without demanding answers, to the river valleys of ancient China, where the Chan masters taught that water needs no instruction on how to flow, to quiet hermitages in Vietnam, where scholar monks learned that the deepest wisdom often looks like doing nothing at all. From the forest traditions of Thailand and Burma to the high passes of Tibet, one truth has been quietly preserved across centuries and cultures, that there is a profound art in allowing in meeting life, not with a clenched fist, but with open hands. This video offers contemplative stories inspired by Buddhist wisdom, created for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Let it be simply what it is, a companion for the quiet hours. So if you are willing, let your body soften a little now. Feel the surface beneath you, the warmth of it, the weight of it holding you without asking anything in return. Feel your breath arrive on its own, without effort, without instruction. Notice how your lungs already know what to do. You do not need to stay awake to receive what these stories offer. If sleep finds you, let it come. You are not missing anything. You are arriving. And now, gently, we begin. In the 12th century, on the slopes of Hagasan Mountain, in what is now the southern part of the Korean peninsula, the autumn fog came in low and heavy each morning, filling the valleys between the pine ridges until the trees seemed to float on white clouds. The stone pathways of the small hermitage, they were dark with moisture before sunrise, and the monks who walked them moved carefully, their hemp sandals finding each step through the grey half-light. By the time the first bell rang a deep, resonant sound that rolled down the mountain like a slow wave, the mist had usually climbed the lower pines and settled into their branches, and the air smelled of wet stone and old wood, and the faint sweetness of pine resin warming somewhere nearby. It was the kind of morning that makes a body want to stop moving, to simply stand and let the mountain breathe around it. At this hermitage lived a monk named Haesong, who had come to the mountains 4 years earlier, carrying nothing but a cloth bundle containing 2 changes of robes, a small knife for cutting kindling, and a question he could not put down. He was 29 years old. Before the mountain, he had lived in the city of Gaeseong, in the northern part of Goryeo, where his family ran a counting house, a respectable business dealing in grain measurements and land disputes and the lending of rice to farmers who could not wait for harvest. His father was a careful man who recorded everything in neat columns, who kept his worries locked inside a formal manner, who taught Haesong from boyhood that the world required constant management, constant vigilance, constant effort to keep things from slipping. The fields must be assessed. The accounts must be balanced. The contracts must be enforced. And if a man did not push against the world's tendency toward disorder, the world would swallow him whole. Haesong had believed this. He had believed it in his hands, and in his jaw, and in the tight space behind his eyes, where he calculated and recalculated everything before sleep. He kept mental ledgers of conversations he had handled badly, decisions he might revise, obligations unpaid. Even when the harvest was good and the accounts were correct, he felt the low thrum of anticipation, as if disaster was simply waiting for him to stop watching. He did not know, at the time, that this was suffering. He thought it was simply what being awake felt like. The change came not from a great event, but from a small one. One evening in late spring, he had gone to the river outside Kaesyeong to collect his thoughts before a difficult meeting the following morning, and he had watched a wide branch, heavy with new leaves, dislodged from some upstream tree moving down the current. He expected to watch it struggle against the bends and the shallow rock, expected it to snag and spin and fight its way through. Instead, it simply moved. The water took it left, and it went left. The water slowed, and it slowed. Where the current narrowed through two stones, the branch tilted slightly and slipped through, as though it had known to do precisely that. No resistance, no fighting, no effort, and yet it arrived, steady and unhurried, at the wide, flat pool below the bend, and floated there in the evening light, as if it had always meant to be exactly there. Hae-sung stood watching for a long time. Then he walked home. He sat with his wife and ate his dinner. He did not mention the branch, but something had been disturbed in him, not broken, not resolved, but disturbed. The way water is disturbed when something small falls into it and the circles move outward and outward until they touch the bank. He entered the monastery at Hapcheon 6 months later. He spent 2 years there under teachers who were learned and kind, and from whom he absorbed foundational practice and the rhythms of monastic life. Then, seeking deeper stillness and the chance to work with a specific question that was forming in him, a hwadu, a question he could feel but not yet articulate, he received permission to travel south to the hermitage at Hagasan, where a teacher named Seon Master Chunpo was said to sit in silent practice for months at a time and to teach through the quality of his presence as much as through words. Chunpo was 63 years old. He was small and lean, in the manner of men who have lived close to mountains for decades, and he had large, calm hands that moved slowly when he did anything: poured tea, adjusted a lamp, gestured toward a cushion for a student to sit. He was not the kind of teacher who spoke in paradoxes to create dramatic confusion. His method was gentler and stranger than that. He simply required students to sit near him, to practice their own contemplation, and to bring him, at regular intervals, the precise thing they were fighting against. When Hae-sung arrived and described the quality of his inner life, the constant calculation, the vigilance, the low anticipatory dread, Chunpo listened, with his eyes half closed, and said nothing for some time. Then he said, "You are a man who fights the river." Hae-sung said he did not understand. Chunpo said, "You are standing in the river right now. You have always been standing in it, and you spend all your energy pushing back against the current to keep from being swept away." Yes, Hae-sung said that sounded correct. That was what he had always done. Chunpo looked at him gently. "Suppose you stopped pushing, just for one moment. Suppose you let the water be the water. What would happen? I would be swept away," Hae-sung said, and he said it immediately, without hesitation, because this was what he genuinely believed. He had believed it since childhood, that the world without his management would spin into ruin. That rest was simply a polite name for drowning. Chunpo nodded slowly. "That is the belief we will sit with," he said. "Not fight, not solve. Sit with." And so began 4 years of practice. that Haesong would later describe to his own students when he had any as the most uncomfortable and ultimately the most peaceful experience of his life. The discomfort came first. Sitting in long meditation sessions beside Chunpo, Haesong discovered that his mind did not simply settle when asked to. It produced enormous quantities of planning and replanning, of remembered conversations, of anticipated difficulties. A single hour of sitting revealed more thinking than he had known was happening inside him, a constant stream of adjustment and assessment, a mind that had never, not once, simply allowed things to be as they were. Every sensation in his body became a problem to manage. A stiff knee required solution. A noisy bird required mental commentary. The cold in the stone floor required comparison to previous cold, calculation of how much longer he would need to endure it, rehearsal of what he would tell his teacher about the difficulty. He told Chunpo about this after the second week, half in confession and half in exhaustion. Chunpo listened. Then he asked, when the bird was making noise, was the bird suffering? Haesong said no. He supposed the bird was simply being a bird. And when your knee hurt, was your knee suffering from the ache, or were you suffering from the thought that the ache should not be there? Haesong opened his mouth and then closed it. He sat with this for several minutes. Then he said, quietly, from the thought. Chunpo looked at him with what Haesong would later recognize as enormous patience, the patience of a man who has already crossed the river and is simply standing on the other side, unhurried, watching someone discover the stepping stones. You have spent 30 years suffering the thought that things should be different from what they are. Chunpo said, the knee aches, and you add the thought that it should not. The bird calls, and you add the thought that it should be quiet. The accounts are unbalanced, and you add the thought that the world is falling apart. The river is flowing, and you add the thought that you will drown. The original experience is small. What you add to it is large. Very large. He poured tea then slowly, in the way he did everything, with a quality of unhurried attention that Haesong found both calming and faintly mysterious. Outside the paper screen of the study room, the fog was moving through the pines again, and the morning light was the color of old silver. Your work, Chunpo said, setting the tea before his student with both hands, is not to stop the thinking, not to make the mind go quiet. That is another form of fighting. Your work is simpler and harder than that. Your work is to notice what you add, the small stone of experience, and then the large building you construct on top of it. The months that followed were not dramatic. Haesong did not have a sudden awakening. He did not wake one morning in tears of recognition, or hear a sound that shattered his assumptions, or find the words of a text rising off the page to meet him. What happened was slower and stranger. He began, simply, to notice when the work in the kitchen was difficult. He noticed the difficulty, and then noticed the moment when he began constructing a story about how the difficulty meant something, how it was a sign of something else, how it connected to a larger pattern of suffering he should address. He began to feel the difference between the difficulty itself and what he was building on top of it. It was like learning to see two things at once, the ground and his own footprint on the ground, the experience and his response to the experience, and in the space between them, that small, quiet space, something began to breathe. One autumn morning, 2 years into his time at Hagasan, Haesong was carrying water up the mountain path from the stream below. The buckets were heavy and the path was steep, and his shoulders ached from the previous day's work, splitting firewood. He was tired. The fog had not cleared yet, and he could not see more than a few steps ahead. A stone turned under his sandal, and he stumbled, and some water spilled. And for a moment, the old voice rose with full force. This was difficult. This was wrong. Things should not be this way. He should not be tired. The path should be clearer. The bucket should not have tipped. He was failing at something. At what? He did not even know. He was simply failing. That was the voice. That was the building being constructed on top of the small stone of a stumble. And then, not through effort, not through discipline, but through something that felt more like recognition, he simply stopped adding. He set the buckets down on the path. He stood in the fog. His shoulder ached. Some water had spilled. The stone was still there on the path. These things were true, and they were enough. They were small, and they were real, and they did not require a building on top of them. He stood there for some time. The fog moved through the pines. A bird called twice, and then was quiet. Below him, down the mountain, a temple bell rang its slow morning note, not asking anything of him, not requiring anything, simply being the sound that it was. He picked up the buckets and walked on. When he told Chunpo about this later, sitting in the stone-floored study room with tea growing cold between them, the teacher was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You let the river carry you." "I was afraid," Haesong said. "For a moment, I was afraid that if I stopped adding to it, if I just let things be what they were, something terrible would happen." And did it? The water spilled. My shoulder hurt. The path was steep. I arrived at the top, and the buckets were still mostly full. Hunpo smiled. It was a rare expression on his long, still face. "Things happened," he said, "and you were present for them, not bracing, not managing, present." He looked out the window at the fog on the mountain. "Most people," he said slowly, "are so busy building the structure of what things mean that they are never actually present for the things themselves. They are not here. They are in the building." He turned back to Haesong. "What did the fog smell like?" Haesong paused. Then, with something in his face that had not been there before, a softness, a small surprise, like pine, and cold water, and something else, the stone of the path after rain. "You were here," Chunpo said simply. "There is something this story touches that you may recognize right now, in the quiet of this night. There is a version of you that has spent enormous energy building structures on top of your actual experience, constructing meanings, cataloging what is wrong, calculating what you must still fix before rest is permitted. You are a counter of grain, an assessor of fields, a person with an invisible ledger open somewhere behind the eyes. The day has left its residue in you, and the mind has already begun its night work, sorting, analyzing, worrying forward into tomorrow. Notice, if you can, the difference between what is actually here and what you are adding to it. Right now, in this moment, what is actually here is the warmth of where you lie, the breath arriving without instruction, the darkness behind your eyes, soft and without edges, the sound, perhaps, of the night outside, whatever it is, wind or silence, or the distant sound of a sleeping house. These things are small. These things are real. They do not require a building on top of them. The building, the thoughts about tomorrow, the inventory of what went wrong today, the low, anticipatory hum of things that need managing. That is what you add. And you've been adding for a long time. so long that the adding feels like you, feels like consciousness itself. But Haesong stood on the mountain path in the fog and put the buckets down and discovered something. The world did not collapse when he stopped managing it. The water spilled and the stone was wet and the bell rang below, and none of it required a structure of interpretation. It simply was, and in that simply was, there was something he could only describe. Later, to his own students, as the first real breath he had taken in 30 years, you do not need to stop thinking tonight. The mind will do what the mind does: produce and consider and arrange and rearrange. This is its nature, as the river's nature is to flow. What Chunpo offered Haesong was not the stopping of thoughts, but the noticing of them, the small, quiet step backward that reveals the thinker as distinct from the thought. Not fighting, not solving, noticing, and in noticing, something loosens. The structure becomes less solid. The building, seen clearly, reveals itself as a building, not as the world. And behind the building, or rather beneath it, the actual ground remains, steady, simple, asking nothing. You cannot stop the river. The mind produces what the mind produces. The thoughts about tomorrow, the replaying of today, the small anxieties that have no clear object, these are the river flowing. Fighting them is fighting water. You will exhaust yourself, and the river will continue. But you can notice, you can take the small step backward, not out of your experience, but inside it, that reveals the difference between the thing and the story you are telling about the thing. Between the stone on the path and the building you construct, to explain why the stone was there and what it means. Allowing does not mean not doing. Haesong still carried the water. He still split the firewood. He still sat for long hours in practice and walked the mountain paths and attended to the work of each day. Allowing means doing without the layer of resistance wrapped around the doing, without the constant narration that what is happening should be different from what it is. Water does not resist the riverbed. It accepts the shape it is given and moves with complete efficiency, arriving at the sea by the most natural path available. This does not make water passive. Water carved canyons. Water wears through stone. Water carries entire mountains down to the sea, grain by grain, in no particular hurry. Your shoulder may ache. Your mind may produce its residue of the day. The path is steep and foggy and imperfect. And still you arrive. Still the water is mostly full. Still the bell rings, unhurried, below. Let the river carry you tonight. Not because you are surrendering to something terrible, but because the world, stripped of the building you have constructed on top of it, is much smaller and much more manageable than you have made it. Because the fog smells like pine and cold water and stone after rain. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Feel the weight of your body now. Let it be heavy, not the heavy of burden, but the heavy of something that has been allowed to stop holding itself up. Your breath arrives and departs and arrives again, effortless, without any instruction from you. Just this moment, just as it is, just this breath, just this. Nothing to add, nothing to build, just this. And as that recognition settles in you, as the building loses one brick, and then another, we travel now, gently, down the mountain and across the water to the wide river valleys of ancient China, where a different kind of mind sat with the same fundamental silence and found the same clear ground beneath the fog. Breathe out slowly. let the night hold you, and let the next story arrive on its own. The way the river arrives at the sea, without effort, without plan, simply following what is most natural. In the middle of the 8th century, in the province of Jiangxi in southern China, the town of Hongzhou sat along the Gan River, where the water ran wide and slow, and the color of old bronze in the late afternoon light. The town smelled of river mud and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of wet silk that had been stretched and dried in the sun, for Hongzhou was known for its weavers, men and women, both, who worked in long open workshops along the riverbank, where the humidity of the water kept the threads pliable and the looms clattered from before dawn until the oil lamps were lit at dusk. In autumn, when the river mist came in each morning, like a visitor who had forgotten to knock, the workshops emerged from the white. Slowly, first, the smell of charcoal fires lit to warm, cold fingers. Then the sound of the first shuttles beginning their back and forth rhythm. Then the shapes of the buildings themselves, solid and familiar against the pale sky. By the time full light arrived, the looms were in full voice, and the Gan River moved past it all with its ancient indifference, neither hurrying nor pausing, taking nothing with it except what the current naturally gathered. 3 buildings from the river, close enough that she could hear the water through the eastern wall, but far enough that the mist cleared by mid-morning. Mingju ran the workshop she had inherited from her husband's family. The light that came through the eastern window in the first hours of the day was clean and direct, and good for seeing fine work, for seeing where a thread had pulled too tight, where the weft had drifted by a fraction, where a color had blurred into its neighbor. Mingju had learned to read cloth the way other women read faces, with a quick assessment that missed nothing and required no apparent effort. She was 44 years old and had been weaving since she was 7. Her husband, Liang, had died of river fever 11 years earlier. In the hot month of July, when the air sat heavy and still over the valley and the medicine sellers in the market could not keep up with demand, he had been a good man, not brilliant, not difficult, but steady and warm in the way of people who have never been badly frightened by life. His death had frightened Mingju, badly enough for both of them. She was 33 years old, with 2 daughters, aged 9 and 6. Asun Stilun Bun, 40 bolts of unfinished silk in various states of completion, 3 workers who would need to be paid at the end of the month, and a workshop lease that came due in 60 days. She had not stopped moving for approximately 11 years. She was not a woman who examined herself closely. There was no time and, she suspected, no particular benefit. The work was the work. The children were the children. The silk did what silk did when handled correctly, and did what silk did when handled incorrectly. And she had long since learned the difference. She was efficient, clear-eyed, and respected in the weaving quarter for the quality of her cloth and the reliability of her word. She did not complain publicly. She did not cry where anyone could see. She slept 6 hours when she could manage it, and 5 when she could not. And she kept the workshop's accounts in a small brush-written ledger that she updated each evening before the lamp went out. The grief for her husband was somewhere in her. She knew she had put it somewhere and not yet gone back for it. This was not something she thought about often. There were more immediate things to think about. She knew of the Chan master whose monastery sat just outside the city, a man named Dao Yi, whom people called Mazu, the horse ancestor, because of a verse someone had written about his broad-footed gait and the bull-like directness of his gaze. She had heard merchants at the market speak of him with the kind of reverence people reserve for things they did not fully understand, but felt they ought to respect. She had no strong feelings about Chan Buddhism or any other kind of Buddhism. She made offerings at the small temple near the market at New Year and on the anniversary of her husband's death, and she found in these acts not transcendence, but a kind of orderly comfort, the satisfaction of a duty properly discharged, like closing a well-kept ledger. She had a loom to operate, and 3 children to feed, and 40 bolts of silk at various stages of completion, and the distance between her daily life and the life of monks who sat in contemplation, asking questions about the nature of mind, seemed, to her, roughly the same as the distance between Hongzhou and the moon. What changed? Things began not with her, but with a young monk who appeared at her workshop door one October morning, asking if she could spare a bowl of hot water for tea. He was perhaps 22, thin in the manner of someone who had recently been ill, with an earnest, unguarded face and hands that were softer than any weaver's, the hands of a person accustomed to holding brushes rather than shuttles. His name was Wen Qing, and he was a student at Mazu's monastery, sent to spend 3 months living simply in the town, not preaching, not begging, simply living as part of a practice his teacher had described only as "go and be ordinary among ordinary people." He had been given no further instructions, which he found more unnerving than a list of rules would have been. Mingju looked at him in the doorway, for a moment, assessed him the way she assessed everything, quickly and without visible deliberation, and then told him to come in and sit on the low stool near the window, and went back to her loom. The hot water would take a moment. He could wait. The monk sat quietly. He watched her work. The shuttle moved back and forth in a rhythm so smooth and unvarying that it seemed almost mechanical. And yet, the closer he looked, the more he saw the fine, constant adjustments, the slight release of tension here, the fractional correction there, the way her left hand anticipated what her right hand would need a half-breath before it needed it. She was not thinking about what she was doing. He could see that clearly. Her eyes were focused on the cloth being born from the loom's motion, but her focus was not the focused look of someone solving a problem. It was something softer, something without effort. "You are not fighting it," he said, almost to himself. She glanced at him without breaking her rhythm. Fighting what? The silk? The loom? Any of it? "If I fight the silk," she said, "the thread breaks. If I fight the loom, the pattern is ruined." I learned that when I was 7, he was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "My teacher says something very similar," he said at last. "He says ordinary mind is the way. He says that what most people call enlightenment is simply what happens when a person stops insisting that things be different from what they are." Mingju set down the shuttle and looked at him with the expression of a person who has been told something obvious and is not yet sure whether to be grateful or insulted. "Your teacher says what I do at my loom is the way. He would say there is no difference between what you do at your loom and what he does when he walks to the river for water. The thread does not resist the shuttle, because the shuttle belongs to the thread. The water does not resist the jar." He paused. "He says most people spend their whole lives insisting that things be different from what they are, and that this insisting is the source of every suffering." Mingju looked at him for a moment longer. Then she reached for the shuttle again. "Tell your teacher," she said, not unkindly, "that most people insisting have children to feed and workshops to run." The monk smiled and accepted the hot water when her assistant brought it and drank his tea and said nothing more. But he came back the following day, and the day after that, and after the first week, Mingju had stopped registering his presence the way you stop registering a piece of furniture that has always been there. He was simply a feature of the workshop, mornings quiet, undemanding, occasionally helpful with small tasks such as sweeping, carrying water, holding finished bolts while she measured them out. He did these things without fuss and without the self-conscious helpfulness of someone trying to prove a point. He simply did them and then sat back down and watched and was quiet. He asked questions sometimes, simple questions that were not simple. Why do you choose this color rather than that one? How do you know when the tension is right? What happens in you when the work goes wrong? Mingzhu answered these questions with the directness she applied to everything. She chose colors by feel, by what the cloth seemed to want. She said, and then caught herself saying it and looked faintly surprised, because she had not put it that way before. She knew the tension was right, the same way she knew when her children were unwell, not from a measurement, but from a quality of response. The way the thread pushed back against her fingers with a particular aliveness when the weave was correct. What happened in her when the work went wrong was harder to answer. She started to say, irritation, then stop. What actually happened was larger than irritation. The wrong moment in the work set off a chain of calculation, how far behind, what the cost, what the customer would say, what it meant about her competence, her prospects, her children's future. A single misplaced thread could, in the architecture of her mind, become a premonition of ruin. She said this to the monk one afternoon, surprised by her own candor, and he looked at her without judgment and said, "My teacher calls that the second arrow." She did not know the term. He explained it, the teaching that when we experience pain, we cannot always prevent it. The thread breaks, that is the first arrow, and it hurts. But then we shoot a second arrow into ourselves, the story we tell about what the break means, the edifice of interpretation we construct on top of the original small pain. The first arrow is often unavoidable. The second arrow is always our own doing. Mingzhu was quiet for a long time after this. She went back to her work. The loom resumed its steady conversation with the thread. The afternoon light shifted, gold deepening toward amber as the sun moved behind the western wall, and the river murmured its old murmur outside, and the sound of other workshops came and went on the breeze. She was thinking about the past 11 years. She was thinking about all the second arrows. There had been thousands of them. Every error at the loom expanded into catastrophe. Every difficult customer became a threat to her livelihood. Every illness in the children became the beginning of something permanent. Every time the accounts came out slightly short, she had lain awake, constructing the full architecture of failure, the workshop closing, the children hungry, the long-faced relatives coming to help in that particular way that made help feel like a judgment. She had built these structures so many times and so automatically that she had ceased to notice she was building them. She had believed, without examining the belief, that this building was the same thing as care, that the elaborateness of her worry was proportional to the depth of her love for her children and her work. Now she sat with the monk's simple phrase and felt something loosen in her chest. The thread breaks. That is real. The structure you build on top of it, that is you. That is optional. The following week, something happened that would have seemed, in another time, like a significant misfortune. A bolt of silk she had been working for 9 days, cloud and crane pattern for a merchant in Fuzhou. One of her better commissions of the season caught on a small splinter she had not seen in the frame's edge and tore. Not catastrophically, but enough. A section of perhaps a hand's width, cutting through 12 rows of the finished pattern. She sat looking at it. The old architecture began to assemble itself immediately. She could feel it rising, the calculation of days lost. The merchant's probable reaction, the cost of replacement thread, the ripple effect on her other orders, the judgment this implied about her attentiveness, her declining competence, the approach of age, She put her hands flat on her thighs. She breathed. The silk was torn. This was true. It was a real fact. It existed in the world, independent of what she thought about it. Everything else, she could feel her mind beginning to construct. That was the second arrow. That was the building being erected on top of the small, real, manageable fact of a tear. She looked at the tear for a long time without adding anything to it. The thread was good thread. The pattern was repairable. The merchant in Fuzhou was a reasonable man who had done business with her for 4 years. The damage would cost her perhaps 2 days. 2 days was 2 days. It was not the end of the workshop. It was not the beginning of anything except a repair. She set down the shuttle and went to make tea. When Wenqing arrived the next morning and she told him what had happened and what she had done, or rather what she had not done, what she had chosen not to add, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter than surprise. Recognition, perhaps. "My teacher," he said, "has never woven silk. But I think he would say that you have understood something he has spent many years trying to put into words." Mingju poured him tea. "Tell your teacher," she said, "that a weaver figured it out. Perhaps next time he can simply send his students to a workshop." Wenqing laughed, a genuine laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who has heard an unexpected truth arrive in an unexpected form. And Mingju, pouring her own tea, found that she was smiling, not at the joke particularly, but at something behind the joke, the strange lightness of a woman who has set down a very heavy thing she had been carrying for 11 years and discovered that the ground beneath her feet was, and had always been, perfectly solid. There is something in this story that may be closer to you than you realize. You do not have to be a weaver in Tang Dynasty China to recognize the architecture Mingju had been building. You have been building your own version of it. Perhaps for years, perhaps tonight. In the quiet of this room, you can feel some part of it still under construction, the anxious review of what went wrong, the projection of what might go wrong, the elaboration of small difficulties into large structures that press against the inside of your chest. This is the second arrow, and you are the one holding the bow. The first arrow, the actual difficulty, the real loss, the genuine disappointment that is part of a life lived with full engagement in the world. There is no practice that removes the first arrow. The thread breaks. The plan fails. The person you love suffers, and you cannot prevent it. The day is harder than it should have been. These are real. They are small, and they are real. But the structure you build on top of them, the elaboration, the projection, the story about what the difficulty means, and what it predicts, and what it says about you, that is the second arrow. That is the building you have been constructing on the ground of your actual experience. And the building is always larger than the ground it stands on. What Mazu Daoyi taught from his monastery outside Hongzhou was this: ordinary mind is the way. Not a perfected mind, not a mind from which all thought has been removed, or all difficulty has been smoothed away. The ordinary mind, the mind that weaves, that repairs, that makes tea after a setback, that gets up in the morning and does the work. This mind, when it is not shooting second arrows into itself, is already the way, already sufficient, already at rest in the only ground there is. You do not need to achieve something different from what you already are. You are already breathing without effort. Your heart is already beating without instruction. The blood is already traveling its ancient routes through you, steady and unhurried, doing precisely what it was designed to do. This is the ordinary mind. This is the way that asks nothing of you that you are not already doing. The insistence, the insisting that this night be different, that your thoughts be quieter, that sleep come faster, that you be other than you are. That is the second arrow. And you can set it down, not through great effort, through the small, humble act of noticing that you picked it up. Just this breath, the thread finding the shuttle on its own, the water accepting the shape of the jar, the cloth unfolding from the loom's patient motion. You are already weaving. You have always been weaving. The pattern is already emerging. Rovbiro, in no particular hurry, arriving at its completion through the accumulated motion of 10,000 ordinary moments. Let this one be ordinary. Just this warmth, just this darkness, just this quiet breath arriving without being summoned. Nothing to add, nothing to build. The ground is already here, beneath whatever structure the mind has constructed tonight. Solid, simple, always here, and as that ground reveals itself to you as the building loses one wall and then another, and what remains is simply the plain and sufficient earth, we travel now, gently, eastward, across the sea to Japan, to the mountains of the Rinzai school, where another person spent years fighting what was, and discovered on a single quiet afternoon that peace had been waiting, patient as a loom, on the other side of their resistance, all along. Breathe out slowly. Let the weight of your body settle deeper into what holds you. Let the next story come on its own, the way morning comes without your assistance, without your management, finding its way to you through the simple turning of the night. In the 13th century, in the city of Kamakura, on the eastern coast of Japan, the sea was always present, even when you could not see it. The smell of it came in through every gap in every wall, salt and kelp, and the cold breath of deep water, and on certain mornings in late autumn, when the wind swung around from the northeast, you could hear the waves on the beach beyond the pine hills, even from the training grounds of the inner garrison, even over the sound of wooden practice swords and the shouts of men at work becoming harder men. The city itself had the feeling of a place that knew itself to be important and had not yet grown comfortable with that knowledge. Wide roads were still being carved from the hills. Temple complexes rose along the ridges, their cypress roofs still pale and fresh-smelling, their stone lanterns not yet worn smooth by decades of rain. The great Kensho-ji monastery had been standing for only 20 years, its formal gates and meditation halls still sharp-edged and purposeful against the surrounding forest. And the Chinese monks who moved through its corridors brought with them a quality of presence that many of the samurai who came as patrons found both admirable and faintly unnerving, a stillness that had nothing to do with weakness, a silence that seemed to press back against the noise of their world with equal force. Hayato had come to Kamakura 8 years earlier from a provincial domain to the north, where his family had held a small parcel of land and served a local lord whose ambitions had outgrown his resources. When the lord's miscalculation ended in disgrace and the redistribution of his holdings, Hayato had done what men of his training did. He had found a new position within a larger household, ridden south with his horse and his armor and his set of practiced skills, and presented himself to the garrison at Kamakura with the directness that was his primary social tool. He was 31 years old. He was not a man of great rank or subtle refinement. He could ride well, shoot well, manage men in training, assess ground for tactical advantage, and remain composed when the situation called for composure. He had a square, unremarkable face that people trusted without being able to explain why, and he wore his hair in the manner of his class without particular attention to fashion. He was reliable and thorough and largely without self-pity, which made him useful and made him, in the complicated economy of a samurai household, respected in the quiet way that useful men are respected. He had a habit, though, that he had never examined and would not have named as a problem because it was invisible to him, the way habits are invisible when they are also the thing you believe keeps you alive. He managed everything. He managed the men in his charge with a precision that was, by most measures, exemplary, tracking their training progress, anticipating their weaknesses, forecasting problems before they arrived, and addressing them preemptively. He managed the equipment stores with an attention that the senior stewards commended. He managed his own body with a discipline that allowed him to perform at the same level in the third hour of training as in the first, and he managed, privately, the territory inside himself with the same vigilance, monitoring his own responses, suppressing what he judged to be inappropriate, adjusting his behavior continually against an internal standard of what a man of his position and character should be at any given moment. He did not think of this as suffering. He thought of it as professionalism. He thought of it as the thing that separated men who were useful from men who were not. He had believed this since boyhood, when his own father, a man of similar bearing and similar silences, had taught him by example that the interior life was a horse to be managed, not a river to be permitted. He came to Kensho, not out of spiritual hunger, but out of a practical problem that could not be solved with any of his existing tools. He had begun, in the past year, to sleep badly, not dramatically. He fell asleep without difficulty, and he woke at the correct hour, and he was functional throughout the day. But in the hours between, something was happening that left him each morning feeling as though he had been working through the night, as though some part of him had remained at the management desk while his body rested, reviewing rosters and checking accounts and addressing anticipated difficulties that had not yet arrived and might never arrive. He woke unrested. He found the days slightly heavier than they had been before, slightly more effortful, in a way he could not attribute to any specific cause. A senior officer in his household had spoken of Kenshoji's abbot with a carefully neutral tone men of their class used when recommending something they were not certain they understood. The practice there was rigorous. The officer had said, the Chinese masters were direct. It was not soft. Hayato had heard this as an endorsement and presented himself at the monastery gate on a morning in early winter. The hills white with the first frost of the season, the ocean visible through the pines as a pale grey strip at the horizon. The monk who received him, a young Japanese student who had been assigned to work with lay practitioners, was named Ryokan. He was perhaps 25, slight and self-contained, with the particular quality of attention that Hayato associated with men who have trained deeply in something, though what that something was here, he could not yet say. Ryokan asked him 2 questions in the initial meeting. The first, what had brought him? The second, after hearing the answer, what did he believe the practice would give him? Hayato answered the second question directly. He wanted to sleep properly. He wanted to feel less, as though he were managing something that had not agreed to be managed. Ryokan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what you are managing?" Hayato said he managed his men, his duties, he paused. He had been about to say himself. Ryokan waited. "Myself," Hayato said. "And what part of yourself requires the most management?" Ryokan asked. The question sat in the air between them. Hayato turned it over, with the thoroughness he brought to everything. What required the most management? He thought of his temper, which he kept carefully under restraint. He thought of his uncertainties, which he did not permit to show. He thought of the calculations he ran continuously, the assessments, the anticipations, the preparations for outcomes that had not yet occurred. And then he said something that surprised him as he said it. The part that is always preparing for what has not happened yet. Ryokan looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard an unexpected correct answer and is choosing how to respond to it. That part, he said, is very tired. The practice that Ryokan gave Hayato was not what he had expected. There were no breathing instructions, no posture correction, no sequences of ritual to be performed. Ryokan gave him a single question, a hwadu in the Korean manner, a koen in the Japanese, and told him to sit with it, not to answer it, not to manage it, simply to hold it as he would hold a coal in his bare hand, closely, with full attention, neither gripping nor dropping. The question was, what is your face before your parents were born? Hayato was a practical man. He disliked questions that could not be answered through analysis and effort. He spent the first 2 weeks attacking the question in the only way he knew how, systematically, methodically, approaching it from different angles, the way he would approach a fortified position, looking for weakness, for a way in. He brought Ryokan his answers, philosophical answers, conceptual answers, answers he had reasoned toward through careful steps, and each time Ryokan shook his head once, slowly, and sent him back. You are managing the question, Ryokan said after the 3rd meeting. You are trying to control what it gives you. Stop controlling. Let the question sit in you. Let it do what it does. What does it do? Hayato asked. If I tell you, you will manage that too, Ryokan said, and there was no unkindness in it. This was the instruction that Hayato found most difficult in his life and, eventually, most illuminating. Stop controlling. Let the question sit. He was a man who had believed, with the conviction of long practice, that the appropriate response to any difficulty was increased precision of management, that the reason things went wrong was insufficient foresight, insufficient preparation, insufficient control over the variables. And here was a young monk in a new temple, on a hill above the cold ocean, telling him to stop, to let the unmanageable be unmanaged, to sit with the question the way you sit with fire, present, attentive, neither controlling nor fleeing. He sat. He did not manage, or he tried not to manage, and discovered that the not managing was itself a project he was managing, which made him understand something important. The habit of control had no clear boundary. It went all the way down. He had been managing his sleep, and before that, he had been managing his waking hours. And before that, he had been managing the quality of his own attention. And before that, somewhere, at a depth he could not quite reach, there was something that had been managing, the manager, something that reviewed the controller and found it insufficient and applied more control. It was management all the way to the bottom. And it was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The change came 6 weeks into his practice, on a morning when the frost had returned and the meditation hall was cold enough that his breath made a small cloud each time he exhaled. He was sitting with the question, or rather, sitting alongside it, which was as close to the instruction as he had managed, and he became aware of something he had not noticed in all his years of discipline, a quality of contraction in his body that never fully released, not a specific tension he could locate and address, something more diffuse and fundamental, a quality of being braced, as though the body itself had been in a state of preparation for so long that preparation had become its resting state. Muscles not held against a specific threat, but simply held against the general possibility of whatever might come, against the unmanaged future. He sat with this observation. He did not try to release the contraction. He knew enough by now to recognize the management impulse in that. He simply noticed it. He let it be there. He breathed, and the breath moved through him the way the wind moves through a pine that is willing to be moved. And after some time he could not have said how long something in the bracing eased. Not dramatically, not permanently. A single degree of release, a single loosening of something that had been held for so long it had ceased to feel held and had come to feel simply like the shape of a body. It was not enlightenment. He knew that much. But it was the first time in many years that some part of him had been, for a moment, simply here, not braced against the future, not reviewing the past, simply here, in a cold meditation hall, breathing, with a question he had not answered and did not need to answer, and could allow to sit in him like a guest who required no entertainment. When he met with Ryokan that afternoon, he said, "I think I have been braced against something that has not arrived." Ryokan looked at him steadily. "How long?" Hayato thought about this. "Since I was a boy," he said. Ryokan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The practice is not to stop being a soldier. It is to notice when there is no battle. Right now, in this moment, is there a battle?" Hayato looked around the small room. The oil lamp, the paper screen, the frost on the courtyard stones outside, visible through the gap in the door, the distant sound of the ocean. He checked himself the way he checked the garrison, systematically. Honestly, was there a battle? No, he said. And yet, you have been at war. Yes. With what? He understood then. He had been at war with the possibility of battle. With the future battle that had not arrived, and might not arrive but demanded, in his internal accounting, the same expenditure of resources as an actual battle. He had been spending the energy of conflict against a conflict that existed only in his anticipation, and he had been doing it for so long, and so thoroughly, that he had mistaken the expenditure for vigilance and mistaken the exhaustion for the natural cost of being a careful man. There is something in Hayato's story that the mind you are carrying tonight may recognize. Perhaps not the specifics. Perhaps you are not a soldier. Perhaps there are no swords in your particular life. But the quality of the bracing, the preparation for a difficulty that has not yet arrived and may not arrive, the expenditure of real energy against a conflict that lives only in anticipation, the way the body holds itself as though battle were imminent when the room is quiet, the house is dark, the night is simply the night. This is one of the deepest patterns the mind creates, the habit of treating the imagined future as though it were the present threat. The soldier's body does not distinguish between the memory of past battles, the anticipation of future ones, and the actual present moment of conflict. It prepares with equal thoroughness for all three, and in a person who has trained this way for long enough, preparation becomes the resting state, the bracing becomes the body's default, and what was meant to be vigilance becomes the very weight that makes rest impossible. Notice this carefully, because it is worth noticing. The difficulty you carry tonight, the review of the day's events, the projection into tomorrow, the low, restless scanning for what might go wrong. This is the garrison still at post. This is the soldier braced for the battle that has not come. And no battle has come. The room is quiet. The house holds you as it has always held you. The night outside is simply night, cold or warm, still or windy, doing precisely what nights do. There is no battle right now. Right now, at this exact moment, there is only this breath and this warmth and this darkness. These are small and they are real. The soldier can rest. Not permanently. The vigilance will be needed again when morning comes, and the work of the day makes its demands. But it is not needed now. The garrison can stand down for these hours. The bracing can ease, 1 degree at a time, the way Hayato's eased in the cold meditation hall when he finally stopped managing the release and simply let the breath move through him. You cannot stop the habit by managing it. Hayato learned this in 6 weeks of trying. The control impulse, when you try to control it, only deepens. What you can do, what Ryokan was pointing toward, what Hayato found in the cold hall on the frost morning, is notice. Simply notice, there is bracing here. There is preparation for something that has not arrived. I am spending real resources on an imaginary battle. And in the noticing, not the fixing, not the managing of the noticing, something eases. 1 degree, 1 breath, 1 moment of actually being in the room you are in, rather than in the anticipated room of tomorrow's difficulty. Let your shoulders ease now, the way they ease when someone you trust tells you the watch is over. You can set it down. Not forever, just for tonight. Just for these hours, just for the length of this particular breath. The ocean is always present in Kamakura, even when you cannot see it. And in you, beneath all the bracing and preparation and management, something is always present that has never needed, managing the simple fact of being here. Breathing, alive, held by the night. It has been here through every battle. It will be here when the morning comes. Let it be here now, without armor, without the garrison at post. Just this breath, just this release, just this. And as that 1 degree of easing opens something in you, as the braced soldier in you recognizes, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that the hall is quiet and the night is simply the night we travel now. Gently south and west, to the great river deltas of ancient India, to the Theravada tradition and the teaching of the Buddha himself on the second arrow, because what Hayato discovered in his cold meditation hall is something the Buddha described with characteristic directness in the Pali Canon, and hearing it named plainly, simply, without ceremony, may allow 1 more layer of the bracing to release. Breathe out slowly. Let the frost melt from wherever you have been holding it. And let the next story arrive the way the ocean arrives at the shore, without announcement, without effort. Simply here and then receding, and then here again. In the time of the Buddha, in the kingdom of Kosala, in the fertile plains of northern India, the village of Anupiya sat 5 miles east of the great monastery at Jetavana. Close enough that on still mornings, when the wind came from the west, you could sometimes hear the distant bell that marked the monks' waking hour. The village was small, 43 households, a well at the center, a market that convened on the 6th and 12th days of each month, a banyan tree at the southern edge, whose roots had spread so broadly over decades that 3 generations of children had climbed its great lower arms without ever needing to reach for the same branch twice. The fields around the village produced rice and lentils and a small amount of sesame, enough to feed the households and leave something over for trade, and the river that ran along the eastern boundary brought fish and fresh water and, in the monsoon months, a quantity of rich dark silt that made the following seasons planting reliable and good. Sujama had lived in Anupiya her entire life. She was 47 years old. the wife of a farmer named Damika, the mother of 2 adult sons, and a daughter who had married into a household in the next village and came back twice a month, carrying her youngest child on one hip and news of the wider world on her lips. Sujama was a practical woman with capable hands and a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something strong and particular, not beautiful in the way that young faces are beautiful, but distinctive in the way that things are distinctive when they have been shaped by actual use. She ground her own grain, kept her own accounts in a system of knotted cords that she had devised herself and could read as fluently as a scholar reads script. And she managed the household's relationships with neighbors and creditors and the occasional passing merchant with a directness that people found alternately admirable and unnerving. She was not a woman who thought of herself as a person who suffered. She thought of suffering as something that happened to people who had been badly unlucky, who had lost children, lost harvests, been struck by illness or left by their husbands. None of these things had happened to her. Her children were alive. Her husband was present and diligent. The harvests had been adequate for 30 years. She was, by any reasonable measure, a fortunate woman. And yet, there was a quality in her days that she had never named because she had no name for it, and because naming it seemed self-indulgent in the face of her general good fortune. A quality of low, continuous effort that had nothing to do with the physical work, which she found satisfying, even pleasurable, in the way that skilled work always carries its own reward. This other effort was harder to locate. It lived somewhere between the end of one task and the beginning of the next, in the moments when the hands had finished and the mind had not yet found its next occupation. It was a kind of scanning, a searching, a low-grade unsettled feeling, as though something had been left undone, whose location she could not identify. She had felt it for so long that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that has been continuous for years, the creak of a familiar beam, the call of a bird that lives near the house and sings the same phrase each morning. It was simply there. It was simply what waking felt like. Her eldest son, Sumana, had spent 3 months at the Jetavana monastery 2 years earlier as a lay supporter, helping with the maintenance of the monastery's kitchen gardens during the monsoon season. He had returned, changed, in a way she found difficult to articulate, not quieter. Exactly, and not more distant, but differently present. He still worked the same fields, and ate the same food, and participated in the same conversations. But something in the way he inhabited the daily life had shifted, as though he had developed a small additional room inside himself, where he could stand and observe the rest of the house without being entirely consumed by it. She had asked him about this once, and he had said only that he had listened to teachings, and that one in particular had stayed with him. When she pressed him, he told her about the 2 arrows. She had thought about the 2 arrows for 2 years without going to the monastery herself. The idea had caught in her the way certain ideas catch, not in the mind but somewhere below it, in the body, where things are known before they are understood. She had turned it over while grinding grain, while walking to the market, while lying in the warmth before sleep in the evenings, listening to her husband's steady breathing. 2 arrows, the first unavoidable, the second entirely her own making. She went to Jetavana on a morning in early spring, when the sal trees along the monastery wall were coming into bloom, and their small white flowers made the air smell almost sweet against the background smell of the monks' cooking fires and the river nearby. She had brought a basket of grain as an offering in the manner of lay visitors, and she had dressed carefully, without being able to explain why, as though the careful dressing were a form of acknowledgement that she was coming to something that deserved her full respect. The monk who met her at the outer gate and led her to the visitor's courtyard was young and patient. And when she explained that she had a question she had been carrying for 2 years and would like to speak with someone who knew the teachings well, he nodded without surprise and returned a short time later to say that the elder Sariputta was available and would receive her in the garden. She had heard Sariputta's name from her son. She had not expected him to be an old man. She had imagined somehow that great wisdom arrived earlier than this, that it was a quality of youth rather than of age. He was perhaps 65, small and thin in the manner of men who have eaten carefully for decades, with eyes that were very direct without being aggressive, and hands that lay perfectly still in his lap in a way that Sujama, whose hands were never entirely still, found both calming and faintly astonishing. He greeted her with the courtesy that monastics showed to lay visitors and waited. She told him about the scanning, the low, continuous searching feeling, the undone task quality of her inner life in the spaces between work. She told him that she had heard the teaching of the 2 arrows from her son and that it had stayed with her, but that she did not fully understand it, or rather, she understood it as an idea, but could not see clearly where the second arrow was in her own experience. The first arrow, the original pain, she could not identify a particular pain. She was not unhappy. So what was she shooting? Sariputta listened with the complete attention of a man who has given decades of practice to the skill of listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The salflowers moved in a small breeze. Somewhere inside the monastery, a water vessel was set down with a clear ringing sound. Then he said, "Tell me, in the spaces between your work, when the hands have finished, what does the mind reach for?" She considered this. "It looks for what needs doing," she said. "And if it finds nothing, it keeps looking. And if it keeps looking and finds nothing," she paused, "it becomes uneasy." "Yes," Sariputta said, without emphasis, as though she had confirmed something he had been gently waiting for her to discover. The uneasy feeling that is the second arrow, not the looking. The looking is natural, but the belief underneath the looking, that is the arrow, she did not immediately understand. What belief? He was quiet for another moment. Around them, the monastery garden held its morning sounds, birdsong, distant water, the rhythm of someone raking somewhere beyond the wall. Then he said, "There is a belief in many people who have worked hard their whole lives that is never spoken aloud because it is so deeply assumed that it does not feel like a belief. It feels like simply the way things are. The belief is this, that the present moment, as it stands, is insufficient, that something still needs doing, that rest, genuine rest, the rest of a mind that has set down its searching, is not permitted until all debts are paid and all tasks completed and all possible difficulties foreseen and addressed." Sujama was very still, and because all debts are never fully paid, Sariputta continued, his voice unhurried and even, and all tasks are never fully completed, and all possible difficulties can never be fully foreseen. The belief ensures that the permission for rest never arrives. The mind scans. The mind searches. The mind shoots itself with the arrow of insufficiency again and again. Every time the hands are still, every time the work pauses, every time the present moment fails to contain an obvious task. She felt something move in her chest. Not dramatically, not the cracking open that stories sometimes describe. Something more modest than that. A small release, the way a fist releases when it has held something too tightly for too long and the holding finally becomes more effort than the thing is worth. The first arrow, she said slowly, is the pause between tasks. The pause itself causes no suffering. Sariputta said. The pause is simply a pause. The mind encounters it, and the pause is still and quiet, and the mind finds this stillness unfamiliar and generates a small discomfort. That discomfort, still manageable, still small, is the first arrow. And then, because the discomfort is unfamiliar, the mind shoots the second arrow. Something must be wrong. Something is undone. The stillness itself is a problem to be solved. She thought about this for a long time. The garden was warm with late morning light. The salflowers continued their slow descent from the branches, landing without sound on the raked earth below. How does one stop shooting? She asked finally. Sariputta looked at her with the expression of a teacher who has been asked the correct question. One does not stop shooting by deciding not to shoot, he said. The decision is itself another arrow, another act of management, another instruction to the mind that what is happening should not be happening. The bow cannot be unstrung through force. He paused. The practice is simpler and stranger. It is to notice the arrow in flight, to see it clearly. There it is, the insufficiency story, the debt that cannot be paid, the task that cannot be completed. To see it and not to follow it, to let it pass through the air without adding a second arrow behind it, or a third. He looked at his own hands, still in his lap. The well-instructed disciple, he said, using the phrase from the teaching she had heard, second-hand from her son, feels one pain, not two. Not because the first pain has been removed, but because the second arrow has been seen for what it is, optional, chosen, though not knowingly, and therefore capable of being unchoosed, if not through will, then through the slow, patient development of seeing. Sujama returned to Anupiya that afternoon with the basket lighter than it had come, and something different in the quality of her walking, not faster, not slower, but differently weighted, as though she were carrying the same body with a fraction less bracing against the earth beneath it. Her husband was still in the fields. The house was quiet. She sat in the doorway in the warm light and let her hands rest in her lap the way Sariputta's had rested. Not because she was imitating him, but because something had relaxed in the portion of her that perpetually prepared for the next task. And the hands followed. The stillness was unfamiliar. The scanning began almost immediately. What needs doing? What is incomplete? What has been forgotten? She noticed this. She did not fight it. She watched the arrow in flight, the way Sariputta had described, and she said silently to herself, there it is. The story that this moment is not enough. The belief that rest requires permission. The arrow passed. Another came. She noticed it too. Another passed. After some time, she could not have said how long. Perhaps the span of 30 slow breaths. The scanning slowed, not because she had commanded it to slow, but because the noticing had made it gradually less urgent, the way any alarm loses its power when you recognize it as an alarm rather than as the emergency itself. The afternoon light moved across the packed earth of the doorway. A bird called from the banyan tree at the edge of the village. Her hands lay still in her lap, and the stillness was not comfortable. Not yet, but possible. Not a problem requiring solution, simply the quality of a moment that had been allowed, briefly, to be what it was. There is a teaching embedded in Sujama's story that may arrive for you with particular directness tonight. Because tonight is, in a certain sense, the purest version of the moment she sat with in the doorway. The work of the day is finished. The hands are still, and the mind trained over years, perhaps decades, by the same belief that ran beneath Sujama's days, has not received the message that the stillness is permitted. So it scans, it reviews, it searches the terrain of the completed day for what was missed, what was undone, what was handled imperfectly. It projects forward into tomorrow's terrain and begins its preventive work cataloging, preparing, identifying the insufficiencies in advance so that they can be addressed when morning comes. This is the second arrow, not the day's events, which are already complete and unchangeable, not tomorrow's challenges, which are not yet here and may arrive quite differently than anticipated. The second arrow is the belief, firing automatically and constantly in the space between the hands going still and the mind receiving permission to rest, that this moment, this quiet, warm, already sufficient moment is not enough, that something remains to be done before the garrison can stand down. Notice it now, if you can, not to fight it, not to instruct it to stop. That instruction is itself another arrow. Simply to see it. There it is, the scanning, the searching, the low continuous effort in the space where rest is waiting. Let it be seen. Let it pass through the air without being followed. The well-instructed disciple, the Buddha taught, feels one pain, not two. You have felt two pains for a long time, the pause between tasks, and the story that the pause is wrong. Tonight, in this darkness, the pause is simply the pause. The stillness is simply the stillness. The moment, exactly as it is, contains no emergency. The debts will still be there in the morning. The tasks will still be there. None of them require your attention in this exact hour, in this exact breath, in this precise moment of warmth and darkness and the weight of your body against what holds you. Let the arrow pass. Let the next one pass. And the next, not through effort. Through seeing, the scanning is not you. It is a habit that has mistaken itself for you. And a habit, when seen clearly enough and long enough, begins slowly, imperfectly, without drama, to lose its automatic authority. One arrow at a time, one seen arrow that was not followed. Let your hands rest now, in the way that Sujama's hands rested in the doorway. Let the light move where it moves. Let the bird call from its tree. Let the moment be what it is, complete, sufficient, asking nothing further of you. Nothing remains to be done in this hour. Nothing is undone that cannot wait for morning. The arrow is in the air. You can watch it pass. Just this breath, arriving on its own. Just this warmth, holding you without asking. Just this night, doing what nights do, surrounding, quieting, gentling the world towards sleep. And as that second arrow slowly loses its flight, as the scanning quiets, one noticed thought at a time, and the body settles toward the ground it has always been resting on. We travel now, gently westward and forward in time, to the green mountain forests of Thailand, where a forest monk in the tradition of Ajahn Chah discovered in a single rainy season what Sujama learned in her doorway, that the moment never needed permission to be sufficient, that it always was, that it always is. Breathe out slowly. Let the hands rest where they rest. Let the next breath come without being summoned. The stillness is permitted. You have always been permitted to rest. In the rainy season in northeastern Thailand, the forest around Wat Nong Papong becomes a different country. The dry, dusty, red-earthed woodland that stretches across the Isan Plateau for most of the year transforms within days of the first real rains into something humid and extravagant, the undergrowth thickening overnight. The paths between the meditation huts turning dark and soft underfoot, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and flowering things whose names the monks had mostly not bothered to learn. Frogs appeared from nowhere, in numbers that seemed impossible, filling the evenings with a continuous chorus that began at dusk and did not stop until well after the oil lamps in the huts had been extinguished. Insects arrived at every lit surface. The monastery's great hardwood trees, those that had been old when Ajahn Chah first came to settle this grove in the 1950s. Trees that the villagers had warned him were haunted, dripped steadily for days after rain, the sound moving through the forest at night like a second, slower kind of breathing. It was into this world that Wonkai arrived on a Thursday evening in late July, carrying a small bag of personal items and a large bag of unresolved anxiety, in the manner of a man who has decided to do something difficult and has not yet had cause to question whether the decision was correct. He was 28 years old, a primary school teacher from Bangor, the village closest to the monastery, a village whose houses he had passed 1,000 times on the dirt road between his school and the market, without ever stopping to consider what lay behind the monastery's gates. He had grown up with the forest sounds in the background of everything. He had watched orange-robed monks cross the road on their dawn arms round every morning of his childhood. He had given food from a bowl at the roadside with his grandmother when he was small, and felt the particular satisfied solemnity of that act, and then grown up and forgotten it, and become a man with a job and a restless mind, and a habit of spending his evenings reviewing everything that had gone wrong in the day's teaching, with an intensity that his mother described, with affectionate accuracy, as suffering without a reason. The rains retreat the Vasa, the 3 months during which monks remained in residence, and the monastery opened its gates to lay practitioners willing to stay, had been suggested to him by a senior monk who was distantly related to his father and who had watched Wanchai at a family gathering and recognized in him the particular exhaustion of someone who cannot stop thinking. "You don't need to stay long," the monk had said. "Come for a week. Come and see what happens when you stop moving." Wanchai had agreed in the way that people agree to things they are not sure they mean, and then found himself, some weeks later, actually there, with his bag and his anxiety, and the frogs already beginning their evening. He was assigned a small kuti, a meditation hut, at the far edge of the monks' path network, where the trees were densest and the undergrowth pushed against the wooden walls with what felt, in the evenings, like genuine insistence. The hut contained a sleeping platform, a thin mat, a mosquito net, a small oil lamp, and a shelf for personal items. There was an outdoor washing area 10 steps away. The toilet was a further walk into the trees. Everything was simple in a way that Wanchai found initially austere, and then, more slowly, clarifying the way a room becomes clearer when you remove most of what is in it, and what remains reveals itself to have been the necessary thing all along. The monastery's daily schedule began at 3 in the morning and ended, for lay practitioners, at 9 in the evening. In between, there was group chanting, sitting meditation, walking meditation, the communal meal taken in silence in the early morning, and the long hours of the afternoon that belonged to personal practice, sitting or walking in the kuti or on the forest paths. The body and the mind given time together with nothing required of either, except presence. Wankai was not a person who had spent much time with nothing required of him. He was a teacher. His days were structured around requirement. Children required his attention, his patience, his ability to hold a classroom of 32 7-year-olds in sufficient focus that the morning's lesson could be completed before the lunch bell. His evenings were structured around preparation tomorrow's lesson plans, the week's grading, the reports that accumulated on his desk with the slow, inevitable weight of institutional life. Even his rest had a quality of preparation, of marshalling energy for the next thing. The idea of afternoon hours, whose only instruction was to be present, had a quality, when he first encountered it, of mild panic. The senior monk who oversaw the lay practitioners was a man of perhaps 50, named Fra Alongkot, who had lived at Wat Nong Pa Pong for 22 years, and who moved through the monastery with the particular quality of someone for whom the place had become an extension of his own body, not learned, but inhabited, the way you inhabit a language you have spoken since childhood. He was not an expressive teacher in the style that Wan Chai had expected. He did not deliver long discourses or hold formal question and answer sessions. What he offered was primarily his example, the quality of his movement through the day, which was unhurried in a way that seemed to have nothing to do with being slow. He simply did not resist the pace of things. When the alms food preparation took longer than expected, he was present for the additional time without appearing to experience it as additional. When the rain came hard and the path to the chanting hall flooded, he walked through the flooding in his sandals with an expression of mild interest rather than inconvenience. When Wan Chai came to him 3 days into the retreat with the complaint that he could not stop thinking that the afternoons, which should have been for meditation, were being spent in an elaborate continuation of all the mental work he had hoped to set down, Fra Alongkot listened and then said simply, "What are you fighting?" Wan Chai said he was fighting the thoughts. Fra Alongkot shook his head once, very gently. "You are fighting the fact that the thoughts are there. That is 2 things, not one. The thoughts, and then the war against them." Wan Chai looked at him, not immediately understanding. Ajahn Chah used to say, Fra Alongkot continued, "If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace." He paused. But most people hear this and think letting go means making the thoughts stop. It does not mean that letting go means letting the thoughts be thoughts. Not fighting them. Not trying to make them something else. Not requiring them to go away before you can be at peace. Wan Chai said, "But if I don't try to make them stop, they will continue." "Yes," Fra Alongkot said, with the patience of a man who has answered this question many times and has found that patience is the only useful response. "They will continue, and you can be at peace anyway." Peace is not the absence of thoughts. Peace is what remains when you stop requiring the thoughts to leave before peace is permitted to arrive. This was not an answer that Wan Chai found immediately useful. It was the kind of statement that made sense as an idea and did not yet make sense as an experience. And there is a significant distance between those 2 senses that can only be crossed by living through it. He went back to his kuti and sat on his mat and watched the thoughts continue, which they did, with considerable energy. He thought about his school. He thought about a parent conference he had handled poorly before the retreat. He thought about a student named Arthur who had been struggling with reading for 3 months and for whom Wan Chai had not yet found the right approach. He thought about his lesson plans and whether the person covering his classes was covering them correctly. He thought about whether he was meditating correctly, which is one of the more reliably circular forms of thought available to a person new to meditation. And then, in the middle of this, something unexpected happened. He became very tired of the thinking, not the ordinary tired of fatigue, but a different quality of tiredness, the tiredness of a man who has been pushing against a door for a long time and has finally noticed that the door opens toward him. A sudden, almost absurd recognition. He had been fighting the thoughts in order to have peace. And the fighting was the precise mechanism by which peace was being prevented. He was not suffering from too many thoughts. He was suffering from his relationship to the thoughts, the insistence that they should not be there, which was producing a secondary layer of suffering on top of whatever the thoughts themselves carried. He put his hands in his lap. He breathed. He did not try to stop the thoughts. He watched them, the way you watch rain, not trying to prevent the rain from falling, not finding the rain unbearable, simply watching it fall because it is falling. And you are here, and there is nothing that needs to be done about rain except to let it be rain. The thoughts continued, and something else continued alongside them, a quality of space around them, a quality that had perhaps always been there, and that the fighting had been preventing him from noticing. The thoughts were present, and also there was something in which they were present, some wider quality of awareness, the way a room contains furniture without being defined by it. The thoughts were in the room, and the room itself was, it turned out, perfectly quiet. He sat for a long time. The rain came and went outside. The frogs sang their particular frog concerns to the wet forest. A gecko called from somewhere above the rafters, a small, insistent sound, indifferent to him, going about its gecko business with complete authority. He was 28 years old, sitting in a small wooden hut in the forest of Ubon Ratchathani, with a room of thoughts and the quiet space that contained them. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not fighting anything. He came to Fra Alongkot the following morning after the meal, while the forest steamed gently in the post-rain warmth, and told him what had happened. The monk listened without visible surprise. When Wanchai finished, Fra Alongkot was quiet for a moment, then said, "The thinking did not stop, no." Wanchai said, "It continued." "And the peace came anyway?" "Yes." "Then you have understood something that many people spend years trying to understand." He was quiet again for a moment, looking at the steaming ground. Most people believe that peace requires the right conditions. Quiet mind, quiet environment, no difficulties, nothing left undone. And so they wait for the conditions to arrive before they allow themselves to be at peace. And since the conditions are never quite right, the peace never quite arrives. He looked at Wanchai. "What you found last night, that the peace is here already, underneath the thinking, not requiring the thinking to stop. That is what Ajahn Chah spent his life pointing toward. He used to say, if you wait for everything to be the way you want before you are at peace, you will wait forever. But if you understand that peace is already here, already available, requiring only that you stop fighting what is in the way of it, then peace is always available. Even now, even in the rain, even in a difficult classroom, even when the lesson plan has failed and Arthit still cannot read." Wanchai looked at him. He had not mentioned Arthit to Fra Alongkot. The monk smiled. "Every teacher has an Arthit," he said. Wanchai spent 2 more weeks at the monastery. He did not stop thinking during those weeks. The lesson plans continued to arrive in his mind during afternoon meditation, along with the parent conference and Arthit and various other concerns of the school year to come. But the relationship to the thinking changed slowly, imperfectly, without dramatic resolution. The thoughts moved through him more, the way the rain moved through the forest, present, real, doing what rain does, and not requiring a response beyond simple acknowledgement. Some days, this came easily. Some days, The old fighting returned with full intensity, and the peace was nowhere obvious. But on those days too, there was something beneath the fighting that he had now glimpsed and could not quite unglimpse. The room itself, quiet, even when full of furniture. There is something in Wanchai's discovery that arrives for you now, in this different kind of stillness. This is the first letting go story of tonight's journey, the shift from seeing the pattern to actually, if only for a moment, releasing your grip on it. What Wanchai found in his kuti is available to you in this moment, in the room, or the bed, or the darkness where you rest. The thoughts are present. Perhaps they have been present through all the stories you have heard tonight, reviewing, planning, wandering, returning, doing what thoughts do in the unoccupied hours. This is not a problem. This is what minds do when the day's demands have released them and they have not yet found their way to rest. The thoughts are in the room, and the room is spacious, and the space in which the thoughts move is not the thoughts themselves. Notice this: the breath is moving right now, without effort, without instruction. The body is warm or cool or heavy or light, exactly as it is, not requiring correction. These are real. These are here, and the thoughts, however many there are, however busy they are, reviewing the day or anticipating tomorrow, are also here, moving through the same space that holds the breath and the warmth and the weight of the body against what holds you. The peace is not waiting on the other side of the thoughts. The peace is not contingent on the thoughts becoming fewer or quieter or less persistent. The peace is the space itself, the awareness in which all of this is occurring, which has never, not for a single moment, been other than present. The fighting has been obscuring it, not destroying it. Obscuring it, the way clouds obscure the sky without changing it in any fundamental way. If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. This is tonight's invitation, not the complete letting go, not the dramatic release, simply the small, humble, possible release of this one moment. The thought about tomorrow, let it pass through. The review of today, let it move. The plan for the next thing, let it drift across the room without requiring your full engagement. You do not need to follow every thought. You do not need to fight any of them. The room is large enough. The space is wide enough. The breath continues, and the warmth continues. And beneath the furniture of thought, the room itself holds everything in a quiet that has been waiting, patient as the forest after rain, for you to notice. It has always been there. It may not be able to read yet. The lesson plan may still need work. The things left undone are genuinely undone. And still, beneath all of this, alongside all of this, peace is available. Not the peace of having resolved everything, the peace of the room itself, which is here, whether the furniture is arranged well or poorly, which does not require your management, which has been quietly here all along. Let the thoughts be thoughts. Let the rain be rain. Let the frogs sing their concerns to the dark, wet forest, and let yourself be simply the one who hears them, from the warmth of the hut, without needing to do anything about the rain, or the frogs, or the darkness. Just this breath, just this quiet room beneath the thoughts, just this. If you drift off now, that is perfect. You don't need to stay awake to receive what this night is offering. Sleep is what letting go looks like when the body is ready. Let it come on its own, the way the peace came to Wanchai, not when he achieved the right conditions, but when he stopped fighting the conditions he already had. And as that first true release moves through you, soft, Imperfect. Enough we travel now, gently northwest, to the high cold mountains of Tibet, where a student of the Kagyu tradition sat for 3 years in a stone hermitage above the clouds and discovered that what he had been seeking was not outside the window of his suffering, but woven into the very fabric of it, patient as the mountain, waiting to be allowed. Breathe out. Let the hut contain you. Let the forest breathe around you. Let the next story arrive on its own. Above the village of Nyanang in the highland valleys of southern Tibet, where the land rises steeply from the narrow river plain toward the permanent snowfields, and the sky takes on a particular quality of blue that is not available at lower elevations, a deeper, harder blue, the color of something ancient and indifferent and utterly without malice. There were caves in the rock face that had been used by practitioners since before living memory. Some were small and rough, barely deep enough to keep a man dry in the monsoon rains that arrived each year from the south with unreasonable force. Others had been improved over generations by those who had inhabited them. The entrances widened slightly with patient chisel work. Small stone walls built to redirect the wind, wooden platforms added for sleeping, the stone floors worn smooth by the passage of decades of careful feet. These caves faced generally south and received what sun the high valley permitted, which from late autumn to early spring was not much, but in the summer months was fierce and white, and arrived at the cave mouths around midday and stayed until late afternoon, making the stone warm in a way that felt generous, almost domestic, against the cold of the surrounding rock and the vast indifferent sky above the snow line. The valley below those caves was long and narrow, and inhabited by perhaps 200 families in scattered clusters of stone houses, whose flat roofs were piled each autumn with fuel for the winter months, dried yak dung and bundled brushwood, and, in the better years, a few logs hauled by yak from the lower forests, 2 days' walk to the east. The monastery sat at the eastern end of the valley, near a bend in the river. Enclosed by a low stone wall, its main temple's roof, visible from most of the valley floor, the gilt ornaments at the roof's peak catching the morning light when the sky was clear and winking at great distances. It was a Kagyu monastery, its lineage running back through the great teacher Gampopa to the yogi Milarepa himself. Milarepa, who had spent years alone in high caves like those above Nyanang, who had eaten nettle soup until his skin turned the color of the plants and his bones pressed through the thin cotton robe, who had composed songs of realization in the language of direct experience that his disciples wrote down with the reverence people reserve for things they cannot fully account for, but know to be true. The monastery was small and poor, and proud of both qualities, and it sent its monks into retreat the way a farmer sends seed into prepared ground, with an expectation rooted not in optimism, but in the deep practical knowledge of what happens when the conditions are right and the work has been done honestly. It was to one of the caves above Nyanang, a middle-sized one, set perhaps 300 feet above the valley floor, accessible by a narrow path cut into the rock that required hands as well as feet for the last ascent, that a young monk named Dorje was sent in the autumn of his 23rd year. He was the third son of a herder family from the far western end of the valley, a family that had given monks to the monastery for 4 generations, whose relationship to formal Buddhist practice had the quality of something long settled and natural, the way a tree that has grown in a particular direction for decades has long since ceased to struggle against the prevailing wind. Its growth no longer effort, but simply what it is and what it does. His father had spent 2 years in a solitary hermitage as a young man. His grandfather had spent 5. His uncle, who had died before Dorje was born, had spent 7 years in retreat in a cave above the eastern end of the valley, and was still spoken of in the village with the particular reverence reserved for those who have crossed the threshold. Most people only approach from a respect distance. The expectation that Dorje would eventually do the same was so unspoken in his family that it had never felt like expectation, only like the shape of the life he was moving toward. The way a river moves toward the sea without requiring instruction. What he had not anticipated was how he would feel when the time actually came. He had been a diligent student. 10 years at the monastery had made him fluent in the rituals, competent in the philosophical frameworks, steady in the foundational practices. He had completed the preliminary practices, the Nyundro, with the thoroughness his teachers required. 111,000 prostrations, accumulated over 2 years of early morning sessions that left his knees scarred and his arms stronger than a farmer's. 111,000 repetitions of the purification mantra offered through a visualization practice, so intricate that learning it took 6 months alone. 111,000 mandala offerings. The symbolic gesture of giving away the entire world, performed with a sincerity that his primary teacher had called once and only once, genuinely moving. He had studied Mahamudra texts until he could recite key passages in his sleep, and occasionally did. He was, by any reasonable measure of the monastery's standards, prepared for retreat. He had imagined retreat as an intensification of what he already knew: more practice, longer sessions, deeper states, the same interior landscape he had been cultivating for a decade, only quieter and more concentrated. He had imagined something like the monastery's meditation hall, but empty. A room without other monks, without the daily schedule, without the bells and the communal meals and the administrative obligations that interrupted even serious practitioners. He had not imagined what actually awaited him in the cave above Nyanang, which was not an intensification of what he knew, but a radical confrontation with everything he had been using the monastery's structure to avoid knowing. The retreat would last 3 years. The Kagyu tradition required of serious practitioners a period of complete withdrawal from the monastery's routines, from teaching and being taught, from the company of other monks, from all the social surfaces that allow a person to live comfortably on the outside of themselves without ever being required to encounter what lives within. The retreat was structured, specific practices to be completed, specific numbers to be accumulated, specific visualizations to be held and refined. Over the months, a retreat master at the monastery would receive Dorje's periodic written reports and send instructions back by way of the lay supporter from the village below, a reliable older man named Sering, who brought basic food twice a month and left it at the bottom of the path, without ascending, which suited both of them. In other words, there would be nothing and no one to manage, no social surface to maintain, no student to teach, no schedule imposed from outside to give shape to the hours. There would be only Dorje and the practice and the cave and the long view south toward the mountain ranges that formed the border with Nepal, their peaks lit each evening with a brief burning light that lasted no more than 10 minutes and then was gone, leaving the sky behind it the color of cold iron. What arose in the first months was panic, not dramatic panic. He was a trained monk with a decade of experience, and his panic was quiet and internal in the way that well-trained people's panic tends to be, presenting itself not as terror but as restlessness, an inability to settle into any practice session for more than a short time before the mind began generating urgent reasons to do something else. A vivid and apparently inexhaustible interest in the physical condition of the cave, the gap in the stone wall through which the wind whistled during storms, the stain on the ceiling above the sleeping platform that he mapped obsessively in his first weeks, the way the light moved across the floor at different hours, the sounds rising from the valley below, a yak bell, a child's voice, the particular carry of someone chopping wood that reached him on the right days when the wind came from the north. These sounds arrived like dispatches from a world he had voluntarily left, and whose absence he had not, until now, understood he would feel. And beneath the restlessness, rising in the quiet hours, when the restlessness had temporarily exhausted itself, was a quality he could only describe as himself. Unfiltered, unstructured, unmediated by the routines of community life, without the continuous soft scaffolding of being a monk among monks. Just Dorje, sitting in a cave on a mountain, above a valley, in the world's high interior, with his memories and his preferences, and his unfinished grievances, and his old tenderness for his mother, and his complicated admiration for the uncle he had never met, and his genuine uncertainty, which was growing daily, about whether he had the qualities necessary for what he was trying to do. He had been sent here to find his nature. He had found, instead, that his nature was considerably noisier than he had assumed. He wrote to the retreat master in the 3rd month, describing what was happening with the careful precision of someone who has been trained to observe accurately and fears making himself seem foolish. The retreat master's reply arrived, folded around a small dried flower, whose variety Dorje did not recognize. The reply said 5 words: "You are fighting your experience." Stop. Dorje sat with this instruction for many days. The problem was immediate and apparent. Stopping the fighting was itself something he was attempting to do with considerable effort, which he recognized, in his better moments, as another form of fighting. He had been trained to effort. The preliminary practices were practices of accumulated effort. Those 111,000 prostrations were not performed by allowing the body to do what it wanted, but by disciplining it repeatedly into a shape it frequently resisted. Effort was the currency he had been using since he entered the monastery at 13. He was good at effort. It was, in a real sense, the primary thing he knew how to do. What his retreat master was pointing toward was something that effort, applied in the ordinary way, could not produce. And the recognition of this, that the primary tool he had was the wrong tool for what was being asked, produced in him a quality of lostness that was more disorienting than anything that had come before. He understood, in his mint, the Kagyu teachings on effortless awareness. He could explain Mahamudra in considerable philosophical detail. He knew that the tradition distinguished between practices that develop meditation through effort and the recognition of natural awareness. That effort, past a certain point, can only obscure. He knew that Milarepa had said was recorded as having said that in the beginning nothing comes, in the middle nothing stays, in the end nothing goes. He knew the theory. Knowing the theory and living in its truth are separated by a distance that no amount of additional theory can close. The actual turning came in the 4th month, deep in winter, when the cold had been severe for 3 weeks, and the cave felt less like a shelter than like a stone container for the accumulating cold of the surrounding mountain. He had been sitting in a visualization practice since before first light, working with the central practice of his retreat, a complex interior image requiring him to hold simultaneously a luminous form at the center of his body, a network of subtle light channels branching through his limbs, and a quality of spacious awareness radiating outward from his heart center. And he had been failing consistently, with increasing frustration that he was also failing to conceal from himself with the philosophical language he had been deploying for months to maintain a dignified relationship to his own inadequacy. The image collapsed the moment it seemed stable. The awareness scattered the moment he reached for it. His knees ached. The light through the cave entrance was still the pale grey of earliest morning. He had been sitting for perhaps 2 hours, and it felt like both more and less than that, simultaneously. And then, for reasons he could not explain and would not attempt to explain later, the effort released, not as a decision, not as something he chose, more like the way a hand that has been gripping too tightly eventually releases, not because the holder decides to open the hand, but because the holding has become so clearly and totally pointless that the hand simply understands this and acts accordingly. The straining toward the visualization ceased, and in the space left by the cessation of straining in the small silence, left when a sound stops that you had stopped hearing because it had been continuous for so long, the visualization arose. Not perfectly, not with the clarity that decades of accomplished practice would produce, but present. The luminous form, approximate and genuine, the light channels, suggesting themselves rather than declaring themselves. Present, the way certain constellations are present. You must allow your gaze to soften before they become visible. And if you look directly at them, they disappear. And the spacious awareness from the heart center was warm. Not metaphorically warm, warm in the body, in the chest, radiating outward in the way that physical warmth radiates when something that has been chronically contracted finally. And this was the word that arrived in his mind. Final and accurate, finally, releases. He held it for the time it takes to breathe 20 slow, unforced breaths. Then it dissolved. He sat in the cave with the morning light strengthening against the stone and his knees still aching, and the extraordinary ordinary fact of having briefly, accidentally, correctly practiced the thing he had been failing to practice for 4 months. He did not understand what had shifted. He knew that something had. He knew that the understanding would not come through analysis, because the thing that had shifted was prior to analysis, below the level at which analysis operates, in the territory that the Kagyu teachings had always said was only available by direct recognition rather than by careful thinking. He wrote to the retreat master again. The reply came with a drawing of a river and a small circle positioned within the current rather than on the bank beside it, and 2 written words beneath, now practice. The remaining 2 years and 8 months of Dorje's retreat were not a continuous flowering of effortless clarity. Long stretches of difficulty returned. The mind reasserted its preferences. The cold continued. There were weeks when the practice felt as distant and inaccessible as it had in the first months, when the old reaching returned with full force and the visualization refused to appear, no matter how carefully the ground was prepared. But threading through the difficulty was something he now knew how to find, not by forcing its appearance, but by releasing, at the critical moment, the force he had been applying against the experience. He had learned the difference between the effort that prepares ground and the effort that packs the ground so tightly that nothing can grow in it. He had learned that releasing the reaching was not the same as abandoning the practice. The practice continued. The intention continued. The preparation continued. What was released was the grasping toward the result, the straining quality that was, he now understood, not part of the practice, but a habitual addition to it, imported from a way of relating to effort that was useful in many contexts, and catastrophically counterproductive in this one. He descended from the cave after 3 years and 2 months, considerably thinner, moving with the particular quality of economy that comes not from fatigue but from long familiarity with a terrain that demands no excess. His retreat master received him at the monastery gate, looked at him for a long moment, and said, "You stopped fighting." "Eventually," Dorje said. "It always takes a while," the retreat master said, and then he turned and walked back through the gate, and Dorje stood in the pale autumn light of the valley for a moment. feeling the unfamiliar width of the open sky after 3 years of a cave's framed horizon, before following him inside. What Dorje found in that cold cave in the 4th month is available to you in the warmth of this night, and it requires of you not 3 years, but only this breath. The letting go that the Kagyu tradition points toward is not the abandonment of effort. Dorje still practiced for hours each day. He still accumulated the mantra repetitions, still worked with the visualizations, still wrote his reports, and received his instructions. The effort did not disappear. What disappeared was the effort applied against experience, the straining that turns practice into a war with its own content, that turns the effort to rest into a fight with the fact of being awake, that turns meditation into a battle with the quality of the meditative state. The effort remained and was transformed from grasping toward an outcome into preparing a ground on which the outcome could arise on its own. You may recognize the grasping in this darkness, the reaching toward a sleep that keeps retreating as you approach it. The effort to relax that is itself a form of tension, the insistence that you should already be in a different state than you are, quieter, stiller, further into rest, which produces precisely the agitation it is attempting to overcome. This is the effort applied against experience. This is the figure on the bank, pushing against the current. This is what Dorje spent 4 months doing in the cave above Nyanang before the hand released, and the visualization arose, and the warmth moved outward from the chest, like something that had been waiting patiently behind a door that finally opened inward. The release cannot be forced. This is the central teaching of tonight's deepest letting go story, and it arrives as both instruction and permission. You cannot make it happen by trying harder. The trying harder is precisely what has been keeping it at a distance. What you can do, what Dorje discovered by accident and then learned to approach intentionally, is simply to cease adding the grasping to the intention. Keep the intention toward rest. Keep the willingness. Keep the preparation that is already in place, the darkness, the warmth, the body lying still, the breath arriving without instruction. These are sufficient ground. What grows from this ground does not need to be pulled. It needs only to be allowed. Let the hands open, not as an action requiring effort. Simply allow the holding to notice it has nothing to hold, and release accordingly. Let the jaw complete its last movement, and then not begin another one. Let the eyes remain where they have come to rest behind their closed lids, looking at whatever the darkness offers, which is sufficient. The cave is warm. The light channels are approximate and genuine. The awareness from the heart center is already here, already radiating, already doing what it does without any instruction from you, in the way that your heart has always beaten, and your lungs have always moved, and the blood has always traveled its ancient routes through you, without a single moment of your management. Effortless action. The great release that is not passivity, but the deepest form of trust, that what needs to arise will arise when the grasping has released its interference. In the beginning, nothing comes. In the middle, nothing stays. In the end, nothing goes. Only this breath, only this warmth, only this awareness, looking out through eyes that are resting, through a body that is settling, through a night that holds everything with the indifferent generosity of the high Tibetan sky, vast, cold, luminous, utterly present, asking nothing. The visualization arises when you stop disturbing the water. The sleep arrives when the arriving is no longer being strained for. Release the reach. Let the river carry the circle. Let the cave be warm. Let what was always going to arise in its own time arrive. Now, in this breath, in this releasing, And as that deep bone-level release settles through you, not the small releasing of the forest monastery, but this deeper one, the release of someone who has finally understood that what they were reaching for was never far away. We travel now, gently higher still, into the vast open teachings of the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition, where the sky itself is the teaching, and awareness is not something to be achieved, but something already fully present. Looking out through your own eyes, waiting only to be recognized. Rest now. Keep nothing. Offer the night your full and unclenching weight. In the 14th century, on a white skull-shaped mountain northeast of Samye Tibet's first monastery, ancient already when Longchenpa was born, there lived a teacher whose name meant the vast expanse. The mountain was called Gangri Thökar, White Skull Snow Mountain, and those who came to find him described the same sequence of sensations. First, the long climb through valleys that narrowed as they rose, the vegetation thinning from forest to scrub to bare rock, the air thinning with it, until each breath required what felt like slightly more conscious effort than the breath before. Then the high plateau where the wind came in long, smooth currents from the northwest, carrying nothing but cold and distance, and a quality of complete indifference to human presence or human difficulty. And then, above the plateau, the hermitage itself, a scatter of small stone structures tucked against an outcropping of pale rock, barely distinguishable from the mountain at a distance, visible only by the thin thread of smoke from the cooking fire that rose in the mornings and dispersed almost immediately into the enormous sky overhead. The sky above Gangri Thökar was the sky the Dzogchen teachings pointed toward, not a metaphor, the actual sky, the real, physical, unobstructed sky of the Tibetan high plateau, which has a quality found nowhere else on earth, a depth and a clarity and a kind of attentive silence that makes the sky in lower, warmer, thicker-aired places seem somehow crowded by comparison. Clouds moved through it in the way that thoughts move through a trained mind present, real, arising from somewhere, dissolving into somewhere, never touching the sky itself, never diminishing the sky's depth or its clarity or its fundamental, unalterable nature. This was what Longchenpa was pointing at when he sat outside his hermitage in the evenings, looking up, not a teaching about the sky itself, as the teaching, made available simply by being seen with enough attention and enough willingness to let the sight mean what it meant. Longchenpa had been born to a family of tantric practitioners near Samye in the year of the earth monkey, Itensambalingpa, at a time when the Nyingma school, the oldest school of Tibetan Buddhism, the ancient school, the school that preserved the teachings brought to Tibet by Padmasambhava in the 8th century, was under institutional pressure from the newer translation schools, whose scholastic apparatus was more systematized and whose relationships with the ruling powers of the era were more carefully maintained. He had studied at Sangpu, one of the great monastic universities, and acquired the philosophical training that would allow him, eventually, to systematize the Dzogchen teachings in a way that could meet the scholastic challenges of his time, to show that the direct recognition of awareness was not a departure from authentic Buddhism, but its culmination, its final and most unobstructed expression. He had received the Dzogchen transmission from his root teacher Kumaradza, a wandering hermit master who traveled with his disciples through the valleys of central Tibet with a nomadic intensity, pausing nowhere long enough to become comfortable, keeping the group mobile and exposed to the elements in a way that wore away the usual insulations between the practitioner and the naked quality of experience. He had spent periods of months in complete darkness, in retreat conditions of radical sensory limitation, where the mind, with nothing external to engage, turned inevitably toward its own nature and began, slowly or suddenly, to see what it was. He was 44 years old when Pelmo came to him, which placed her visit in the year 1352. He was by then well into the composition of the 7 treasuries, the great, systematic works that would organize Dzogchen, thought across its full range, from the foundational practices that prepare the ground to the final dissolution teachings that describe what remains when all conceptual overlays have been seen through and released. He composed, and he taught, and he sat in the evenings, looking at the sky above the White Skull Mountain. And people came to him from the valleys below and from considerably further, drawn by something he had that was not authority in the institutional sense. He held no important administrative position, had been driven from Samye by controversy, lived with a radical simplicity that made many of his contemporaries uneasy, but was authority in the direct sense, the quality of someone who has seen something real and has not looked away from it. Pelmo came from a village, 3 valleys east. She had walked for 4 days with a younger cousin who served as her guide on the high mountain paths, arriving at the hermitage in a condition of such visible grief that the monk who met them at the outer boundary of the hermitage compound simply gestured for them to sit and rest before any words were exchanged. She had lost her son 4 months earlier. He had been 7 years old enough to have become entirely himself, with specific enthusiasms and specific fears and a particular way of running that she could close her eyes and see with complete accuracy whenever she chose to, and often when she did not choose to, which was most of the time. He had died of a fever that moved through the valley in late summer, killing 3 children and leaving others untouched with the selectivity that diseases have always had, which provides no comfort and allows no logical response. She had done everything that was done in such cases: the prayers, the rituals, the offerings to the monks at the valley monastery, the consultations with the local healer whose knowledge of plants and timing was considerable and had helped others. Nothing had helped. The boy had died in 9 days, and she had held him through the final night, and in the morning he was gone. 4 months later, she was still inside the grief, the way a person is, inside a house that has caught fire, the fire everywhere. No direction of movement that leads clearly away from it, the heat and the smoke changing the quality of everything she perceived. She had been told, by well-meaning relatives and by the valley monks whose teachings she had attended all her adult life, that this suffering was impermanence, that impermanence was the nature of conditioned things, that her son had karma she could not have altered, that acceptance was the path. She understood all of this. She could repeat it accurately. Understanding it and the grief had no relationship to each other. The teachings passed through the grief, the way light passes through smoke, illuminating nothing, changed by nothing, dispersed into the surrounding air without effect. She was not sure what she expected from Longchenpa. She had heard that he was someone to whom people went with their difficulties, and that he did not always speak much, and that sometimes this helped. She had come because 4 months of not being helped by anything else had produced in her a quality of willingness to try what remained. Longchenpa received her in the small courtyard of the hermitage, where the afternoon light fell directly and the wind was blocked by the stone wall to the north. He was a compact man, neither old-looking nor young-looking, with the particular quality of settled attention that long practice produces in certain people, not a studied stillness, but the genuine article, the stillness of someone whose relationship to the present moment has become, through years of practice, simply their natural mode of existing in time. He listened to her, tell him about her son, his name, his age, the way he had died, without interrupting, and without the sympathetic expression that people adopt when they are preparing to offer comfort. He simply listened, as though the listening itself were the most important thing happening in the vicinity, which she found unexpectedly, to be one of the first things in 4 months that had not felt futile. When she finished, he was quiet for some time. Then he said, "Tell me what you are carrying." She said, "The grief. That is the weight." He said, "I am asking what you are carrying it in." She did not understand the question and said so. He looked at her directly for a moment, with the expression of a person deciding whether a particular door is the right one for a particular visitor. Then he said, "Come." He stood and walked to the low stone wall at the edge of the courtyard, and she followed, and he pointed upward. The sky above Gangri Thoka in the afternoon was enormous. There was no other word for it. At this altitude, with no trees and no structures of any height, and the mountain falling away steeply on 3 sides, the sky was visible in a full, unobstructed arc from horizon to horizon. The blue so deep it was almost violet at the zenith and paling toward the edges where the far peaks met it. There were clouds, 3 or 4 large ones, moving slowly from the northwest, their shadows traveling across the high plateau below with a deliberate, unhurried quality, as though the clouds were not being pushed by the wind, but simply choosing their own direction at their own pace. "Watch the clouds," Longchenpa said. She watched. "What do the clouds do to the sky?" he asked after a time. She thought about this. "They move through it," she said, "and the sky remains. The clouds change shape, yes, and the sky, it does not change. The clouds darken when there is rain in them, yes. And the sky behind them," she looked. Even the darkest cloud, even the heaviest rain cloud she had ever seen, the sky behind it was still the sky. Not darkened, not diminished, present behind the cloud, as it had always been. "The sky," she said slowly, "does not change." "No," Longchenpa said. "It does not change. Clouds arise in it and move through it and dissolve in it, and it remains exactly as it was before the first cloud and as it will be after the last one. The sky does not resist the clouds. It does not fight them, does not try to prevent them from arising, does not mourn them when they dissolve. It simply remains what it is, regardless of what moves through it." She was quiet. The wind moved across the courtyard. One of the large clouds passed in front of the sun, and the temperature dropped perceptibly for a few minutes. And then the cloud passed, and the warmth returned. "The grief," she said finally, "is a cloud. The grief is real," he said, with care. "Your son is gone. That is real. The grief that has arisen from this reality is also real. I am not telling you the grief does not exist or that you should not feel it. I am asking you to look at what the grief is arising in." She did not answer immediately. She stood at the low wall and looked at the sky. The clouds moved through their enormous blue container. They arose and changed and darkened and thinned and dissolved. The sky did not comment on any of this. The sky did not contract when the clouds arrived or expand when they departed. The sky was simply, utterly, irreducibly itself, through all of it. "I have been thinking," she said, "after a long time, that I am the grief." "Yes," Longchenpa said, "I am not the grief." "No," he said, "you are what the grief is moving through, as the sky is what the clouds move through. The grief arose in you. It did not create you. It is not you. You were here before it arrived, though perhaps you were not watching closely enough to notice that the sky was present before the clouds came. She was silent for a very long time. The light changed the particular afternoon shift that happens at high altitude, where the quality of the light shifts from white to gold in a way that takes perhaps 10 minutes, but seems to happen gradually. And then all at once, the shadows lengthened on the pale stone of the courtyard. The clouds continued their passage. Something shifted in Pelmo that afternoon, at the wall of Longshenpa's hermitage. Not the grief. The grief remained, real and present and deep. The death of her son was not amended by the recognition that she was not identical to her grief, that the awareness in which the grief arose was wider than the grief, that she was not the cloud, but the sky. The loss was the loss. The absence was the absence. And at the same time, alongside this, beneath this, in the very same space that the grief occupied there, was something that the grief had not touched, that the grief could not touch, that had been here before the grief arrived and would remain when the grief finally, in its own time, transformed into something softer. This something was not the absence of grief. It was the awareness in which grief arose and moved and changed. The way the sky is not the absence of clouds, but the vast and undisturbed container through which clouds travel on their way, from arising to dissolving. She stayed at the hermitage for 3 days. She did not receive formal teachings or elaborate instructions. She sat in the courtyard in the mornings and looked at the sky. She watched the clouds. She returned again and again to the question Longchenpa had asked, "What are you carrying the grief in?" and to the answer she had found at the wall, something that does not change, something that the grief is moving through, something that was here before and will be here after. Not as a comfort, precisely, but as an orientation, a way of locating herself in relation to her suffering that was neither resignation nor the false cheerfulness of someone pretending the suffering was not real. When she descended the mountain on the 4th morning to walk back through the 3 valleys to her home, she was still a grieving mother. She remained that for many years, but she carried the grief differently after those 3 days, not lighter, but differently placed, as though she had discovered that the carrying was happening inside something larger than what was being carried, and that the larger thing was spacious enough to contain the grief without being compressed or damaged by it. There is something in what Longchenpa pointed to above Gangri Thuka that is available to you in this darkness. You are not your thoughts tonight. You are not the review of the day, not the anticipation of tomorrow, not the worry that has been moving through you with the persistence of a cloud that cannot quite decide whether it is ready to dissolve. You are not identical to any of it. You are what it is moving through. This is the teaching of the sky and the clouds, not a metaphor to be understood intellectually, a recognition to be received directly, the way Pelmo received it at the wall of the hermitage, standing in the cold afternoon light, watching the actual sky above the actual mountain. The thoughts and worries and reviews of the night are real. They are present. They are arising in you, as clouds arise in sky from somewhere, moving through, dissolving into somewhere else, arising again. They are real. They are not you. Notice this, if you can gently, without effort, the way you notice the sky rather than the clouds, when someone finally points out the distinction, beneath the thoughts, beneath the feelings, beneath the weight of the day still settling, there is something that has not been disturbed by any of it. A quality of awareness that has been here, registering, knowing, receiving through every thought, through every feeling, through every memory that arose tonight, and every anticipation, something that watches the clouds without becoming cloud, something that holds the grief without becoming grief, something that hears the frogs and feels the warmth and knows the darkness without being any of those things, without being touched or diminished or altered by any of those things. This is Richba. This is the awareness the Dzogchen tradition has always been pointing toward, not a special state to be achieved after years of practice. The awareness already here, already present, already functioning the sky that has been the sky all along, even when the clouds were so dense you could not see it. Lonkenba's name meant the vast expanse. He spent his life pointing at the vast expanse that was not above his hermitage, but inside every person who came to stand at his courtyard wall and look up. Inside you, right now, the vast expanse is present, not different from what is already here, not requiring additional conditions, simply here, the way the sky is simply here, regardless of the weather. Let the thoughts be clouds. Let them move through the vast sky of this awareness without requiring your identification with them, without requiring you to be them. They arise. They move. They dissolve. You remain the sky, not the cloud. The awareness, not the content. The vast expanse in which this entire night is arising and moving, and slowly, now, beginning its final descent toward the dissolving place of sleep. Your sun is loved. Your grief is held. Your worry is seen. And underneath all of it, through all of it, the sky remains. It has always remained. It will always remain. Just this awareness. Just this vast, undisturbed, quietly luminous sky behind all the weather of this night. Just this. Just here. Just now. And as that sky-like recognition opens something vast and quiet in you, the recognition that you are the awareness and not the thoughts, the sky and not the clouds, the vast expanse and not its contents, we travel now into the final story of this night's journey. We go gently, without urgency, carried now not toward wisdom, but toward its dissolution into the place where wisdom no longer needs to be held because it has become the very texture of the night, the warmth, the breath, the crossing into sleep. Let this transition be the last bridge you are aware of crossing. Breathe out one long, unhurried breath. Feel the sky behind your eyes. Let the vast expanse carry you now. On the northeastern coast of David, where the mountains come down to the sea in steep broken ridges, and the water between the islands is the color of old jade in the morning and almost black by evening. The fishermen knew the weather by the quality of silence before it arrived. Not the silence of calm that had a different weight, a different texture, but the particular silence that precedes change, when the birds go quiet and the water flattens in a way that is not peace but preparation. In this silence, you could feel the whole body of the sea gathering itself. And those who had fished these waters for long enough had learned to read this gathering, the way a scholar reads a text, not by analysis, but by recognition. The way you recognize a voice you have known since childhood, even before you have consciously registered its particular sound. Thai was 63 years old, and he had been reading the sea since he was 7. He had been a fisherman his entire adult life, the son of a fisherman and the grandson of a fisherman, from a family that had lived in the same cluster of houses near the shore for 6 generations, without any of them appearing to find this arrangement remarkable. He had a wife who had died 4 years earlier, a quiet woman who had made excellent fish sauce and who had possessed the rare quality of being entirely comfortable in silence, which Thai had always considered her finest gift, and he had 2 adult children who had moved to the market town 20 miles south and who returned twice a year with their own children in tow. filling the small house with a noise that he found simultaneously exhausting and necessary, the way certain foods are simultaneously too rich and impossible to refuse. He was not a man of spiritual inclination in any formal sense. He made offerings at the small temple near the market when the fishing season was about to begin and when it ended, and on the anniversaries of deaths in his family. And he bowed when he passed monks on the road with the reflexive respect that his parents had taught him and that had been worn smooth by decades of use into something no longer consciously performed. He did not attend teachings. He did not recite sutras. He did not practice meditation in any form he would have recognized as such, though he spent long hours on the water in a state that contemplatives would have found immediately familiar, completely present, completely receptive, the mind doing precisely what the situation required, and nothing else, the body integrated with the boat and the net and the reading of the water in a way that left no gap for the kind of restless thinking that occupies people on land. What brought him to Yentu Mountain in the autumn of his 63rd year was not spiritual seeking. It was grief of the particular kind that arrives, not as a sharp event, but as a slow accumulation, the grief of a man who has outlived most of the familiar things of his life and who finds, in the space where those familiar things used to be, a quality of emptiness that is not peaceful but unresolved. His wife was gone. His parents were gone. 3 of the men he had fished with for decades had died in the past 5 years, one from an illness, one from an accident at sea, one simply from age, stopping in the way that old men sometimes stop, quietly, in the night, without apparent drama. The sea remained. The fishing remained. The children came and went, but the texture of the days had changed in a way he could not name and did not try to name, having no particular language for interior experience. And the change bothered him in the low, continuous way that a persistent minor ache bothers a person who is too busy to attend to it and too aware to pretend it is not there. Someone in the market town had mentioned Yentu Mountain, the sacred mountain to the west, where a king had once walked away from his throne and become a monk, where the bamboo forests were so thick that in the rains the sound of the water on the leaves could make you forget where you were, where monks had been living for longer than anyone's family could remember. Thai had no particular expectation of what he would find there. He went the way he would approach an unfamiliar stretch of water, with attention and without agenda, ready to observe whatever was present, not insisting that it be something specific. The climb took most of a day. The mountain was steep, and the path, worn smooth by decades of pilgrims' feet, curved through bamboo groves and past small stone shrines where offerings had been left and partly dissolved back into the mountain by rain and time. The sound of water was everywhere, the streams that cut across the path, the seepage from the rock faces, and above everything, the bamboo itself, which in the lightest wind produced a sound like distant breath, collective and slow, the sound of something very large, breathing very gently. Thai was accustomed to sound. The sea was never silent, but this sound was different from the sea's sound, in a way he could feel in his body without being able to articulate. The sea's sound was horizontal, spreading outward from a single vast source, while the mountain's sound was vertical, falling through layers, arriving from above and below simultaneously, surrounding rather than confronting. He reached a small hermitage late in the afternoon, where a monk, perhaps 10 years, his junior, was sweeping the stone courtyard with a broom made of bound bamboo branches. The monk did not appear surprised to see him and did not ask his purpose in the way that sometimes made Thai feel he needed to justify his presence with a story that was more coherent than the actual reason, which was essentially that he had come because he did not know what else to do with the quality of emptiness that had settled into his days. The monk's name was New. He offered Thai tea, a thin, grassy tea that tasted of the mountain's rain, and they sat in the courtyard as the light changed from gold to amber to the flat grey that precedes darkness, listening to the bamboo. You live near the water, you see at one point. Not a question. The way a person who has been watching you for a time states something they have observed. All my life, Thai said, the sea changes. Every moment, every tide is different. You do not fight this. Thai considered the question. There would be no point. He said, the sea is the sea. You learn to read it. You don't fight it. New nodded slowly. The bamboo breathed around them. Somewhere above the hermitage, the cloud that had been moving in from the south all afternoon finally arrived, and the temperature dropped by the width of a breath. And then the rain began, not heavily, a light rain, the kind that the bamboo receives with a sound like whispering, each drop landing and scattering into smaller drops that land and scatter again, so that the sound of the rain is itself a kind of music, layered and continuous, not insisting on being heard, but simply being what it is. They sat with the rain for a long time. When the sea gives you something you did not expect, you said eventually, a strange current, a new depth, what do you do? I follow it, Tai said. Or I give it space, depending on what it is. And when it takes something, the monk said quietly, when it takes something you valued, when the current carries away what you were holding. Thai was quiet. The rain continued, its patient whispering on the bamboo. You let it go, he said finally. Not because you choose to, because it is already gone. The sea has already taken it. The only question is whether you follow it into the water. New looked at him for a moment. The light was almost gone now. The lantern in the corner of the courtyard had been lit at some point, without Thai noticing, and its small flame moved in the slight draft of the cooling evening air. You've been a teacher all your life. You said. You taught yourself on the water. You learned to allow what the sea gives and to release what the sea takes. This is the practice. This is what the monks on this mountain have been doing for many years. You arrived at the same place from a different direction. Thai looked at the small flame. He was not sure what he had expected from a monk on a mountain. Something more elaborate, perhaps. Something that required more from him, more understanding, more effort, more willingness to be changed. This felt like being told something he had always known but had forgotten was knowledge. Like being shown a tool he had been using for 60 years and being told its name for the first time. My wife, he said, after a time. Yes, you said. Not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement, as if he knew what came before the word and what came after it, and the space in which the word lived was sufficient. The emptiness, I said. Yes. It does not go away. No, the monk said. It does not go away. Like the place in the water where a stone used to be. The water continues to move differently in that place, even after the stone is gone. This is not a problem to be solved. This is how water works. You know this. Thai sat with this for a long time. The rain whispered on the bamboo. The flame moved in the lantern. The mountain breathed around them, old and unhurried and entirely indifferent in the way that the sea is indifferent, not hostile, not caring, simply present, doing what mountains do, receiving what arrives and releasing what departs, neither holding nor refusing. He stayed that night, and the following day, sleeping on a thin mat in a small room where the sound of the bamboo came through the wall all night, not loudly. Never loudly. Just present. The way the sea was present at the edge of sleep when he was home, a continuous reminder that the world outside his resting was doing what it did, rain or calm, regardless of whether he was watching. In the morning, before he descended, he stood outside and looked at the mountain dropping away below him toward the plains, and beyond the plains, invisible but known, the sea. The sky above Yen Tu was the enormous Vietnamese sky of early morning, pale, luminous, the blue not yet arrived, only the light, arriving from everywhere at once, as it does in the high places, before the sun has cleared the ridge. He breathed the mountain air, which smelled of rain and bamboo and old stone and something else, something he could not name. The smell of a place where many people had sat very quietly for a very long time. The accumulated quality of that, sitting still present in the air, the way the smell of incense remains in a room, hours after the stick has gone out. He had not received a formal teaching. He had not been given a practice to take home, no instructions to follow, no text to memorize. He had been given a cup of tea and a rainy evening, and a monk who had listened as attentively as the mountain itself, and who had said, with great simplicity and no drama, what he already knew. The sea takes what it takes, and you do not follow it into the water. The emptiness is not a problem. It is how water works when the stone is gone. This is something you already knew. You have known it all your life. You had simply forgotten that it was knowledge. He descended the mountain and walked back to the coast and went out on the water the following morning. And the sea was the sea, changing with each moment, taking nothing personal, offering nothing permanent, vast and indifferent and entirely alive. He fished until the light changed, and then he came home, and the house was quiet, with its particular quality of quiet. And he sat in the doorway in the cooling evening and listened to what the silence offered. It offered nothing. It offered everything. It offered itself, the way water offers itself to the hull of a boat, surrounding, supporting, asking nothing, taking nothing personally. Simply present, simply here. Breathe in now. Feel the warmth of whatever surrounds you. Not the concept of warmth, the actual warmth. The thing that is here, in this moment, against your skin, in the air that moves in and out of you without requiring your management. Feel the weight of your body settling, the particular heaviness of a body that has stopped resisting the night. The fisherman's knowledge, you do not fight the current. You give it space. You let it be what it is. The sea takes what it takes. The emptiness is not a problem. The bamboo receives the rain with a sound like whispering, each drop landing and scattering, the sound layering over itself until it is no longer many sounds, but one sound, continuous and gentle and entirely without urgency. This is the sound that sleep sounds like, from the inside, layered, soft, arriving from everywhere at once, asking nothing. Let the water move differently in the place where something was. This is not grief requiring solution. This is how water works. This is how life works. This is how the night works. Receiving what comes and releasing what goes, neither holding nor refusing. The mountain and the sea and the dark sky between them simply present, simply being what they are. Your wife's face, your father's hands, the faces of those who are gone, let them be here. In the water, in the rain on the bamboo, in the way the lantern flame moves, in the slight draft of the cooling air. They are not absent. They have moved into the larger presence, the one that holds the mountain and the sea and the dark sky, the one that holds your sleeping body and this night and the breath that arrives. Now, without any instruction from you. You do not need to understand anything. The fisherman did not understand. He only knew, which is different, the way the body knows the weather before the mind has named it. You know this too. You have always known this. Tonight, in this warmth, in this darkness, in the long, slow arrival of what was always coming, you are already here. You have already arrived. The bamboo receives the rain. The flame moves. The mountain breathes. And you, held by what holds everything, sink now into the sea that has no bottom, the sleep that has no shore, the night that asks only that you let yourself be carried. Nothing more is required. Not even this. Let even this go. Tonight you have traveled far. From the fog-covered mountains of Goryeo, where a monk named Haesong learned to set down his buckets and stand in the simple fact of the morning, to the river workshops of Tang Dynasty China, where a weaver named Mingju discovered that the thread does not resist the shuttle, and the ordinary mind is already the way, through the frozen training grounds of Kamakura, where a soldier finally recognized the difference between an actual battle and the war he had been waging against tomorrow, to the sun-warm doorway of a village near Savati, where Sujama put down the second arrow and found the ground beneath the ground, into the humid forest of Ubon Ratchathani, where a school teacher named Wan Chai sat in the rain and discovered that peace does not require the thoughts to stop, up to the high cave above Nyanang, where Dorje's hand finally released what it had been gripping, and the luminous form arose on its own, from the ground he had prepared, but could not force, to the white skull mountain where Longchenpa stood at the courtyard wall and pointed at the sky, and Pelmo understood that she was not the cloud, but the vast expanse through which clouds travel, and finally to the coast of Dai Viet, where an old fisherman climbed through the bamboo rain and came home with a knowledge he had always carried, that the sea takes what it takes, and you do not follow it into the water. 8 lives, 8 traditions, 8 ways of arriving at the same quiet ground, and now, in the darkness where you rest, all of it dissolves. The stories that found their way to you across centuries and oceans, and the enormous distances between one human life and another, they are already doing their work in the deeper places, the places below thought, where understanding settles not as an idea, but as something closer to weather, something that moves through the body and changes the texture of things without requiring your conscious participation. You do not need to remember anything. The Korean fog, the Chinese silk, the Japanese cold hall, the Indian doorway, the Thai rain, the Tibetan cave, the Tibetan sky, the Vietnamese bamboo. Let all of it dissolve into the one thing that was underneath, all of it, that has been underneath this entire night, waiting patiently beneath the stories and the teachings and the slow accumulation of permission, this warmth, this darkness, this breath. These stories are offered as contemplative companions for the quiet hours, not as medical or therapeutic advice, but as one human tradition's long attempt to say, across all the languages and centuries it has spoken in, what perhaps cannot be said but can be received, you are already enough. The ground is already here. The sky has never not been the sky. If you helped someone find their way to rest tonight, we would be grateful if you shared this with them, but that too can wait until morning. For now, there is only this, your breath, arriving on its own, the night, doing what nights do. The body held by what holds everything, asking nothing, releasing everything, simply endlessly, effortlessly, completely here. Sleep well.